I believe we are live. Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self awareness. I am Artemis, joined today by my wife,
Hello.
and this stream is, as the topic implies, all about masculinity, then and now. So this is essentially part two to the first live stream that we did on femininity. So basically the same topic, femininity then and now, and this is masculinity, the follow up to that. So there's quite a bit that we are planning on going through in this stream. We have the chat open, so of course we welcome anybody to pipe up with comments or questions, things that they would like to add in line with the topic of today's stream. So first, I'm going to go through and just kind of detail what we'll be talking about within this stream. I'll do my best to sort of summarize it and then go through all the points that we have relating to masculinity. So if you haven't seen the stream on femininity, it's not necessarily pertinent or needed that you watch that first. It's quite a long stream. It's, I think, about 4.5 hours that we talked about femininity, and I anticipate the masculinity stream will be fairly close to that as well. So, again, it's not necessary that you watch that one before you watch this, although I will, I believe, at the end card to this and perhaps somewhere in the description, maybe create a playlist so that you can find that other live stream regarding femininity. I think they make quite a good pairing.
Companions, you could say.
Companions, you could say, yeah. So, anyway, to talk about masculinity today, I'm essentially going to frame this sort of through the evolutionary biology lens. And in a nutshell, if I can summarize what we'll be talking about today in such a small thing, it's aiming to be about how in ages past, let's just say, perhaps in our hunter gatherer history, certainly before the era of abundance that we live in now, the roles for the sexes were, in my opinion, different. Their needs were more or less based on survival. Their roles were determined based on the fact that resources were scarce. We didn't have the technology or any of the abundance that we have today. Things you could say maybe were a lot more difficult as far as survival went. And so the roles for men and women, males, females, masculine, feminine, in their relationships were a little bit different. At least they were focused through the lens of survival. So, through the lens of evolutionary biology, basically what that'll mean is that a lot of our behavior is what you might say very close to animals in the sense that it's about reproduction, forwarding the next generation and then, survival, reproducing, those sorts of basic life functions. And in cultures and tribes, ancient peoples, you could say, we have lots of documentation that show there were rituals, there were traditions that helped boys and girls grow into adulthood and grow into their roles as might to be expected of males and females. Today, that's going to be vastly different because we don't have to focus on survival quite as much as we did before. But while we had, let's just say, um, specific roles, things outlined that were passed down from generation to generation that told males and females how to behave to a certain extent, and we had role models for masculinity and femininity. We may have that today, but in my opinion, and as you'll see as the stream goes on, they're not anywhere near as healthy of a role model as we might need in this new age, this new cultural age that we're in.
At least not by our standard.
Right.
We should put that
Yeah,
disclaimer there, I
we
think.
should. Yeah. At least not by what we can see. So, of course, this is our opinion. Certainly not to be taken as, dogma or fact. It's just things that we have noticed that as we go forward here, we hope will be points for people to consider that they may use to help determine what would be a healthy way for them to conduct their expressions of masculinity and femininity, as was in the other live stream. So, um, do you have anything that you would like to add to that before I
Hmm.
continue on?
Well, firstly, thank you, Artemis, for that marvelous introduction. And I agree. Additionally, I would like to add that we are not licensed psychologists, doctors, therapists, anything of that nature. Any information in this stream is purely for informational consideration, one could say, and or for entertainment purposes only. Um, Now that I've covered our buns,
Mm.
let's party.
All right. All right. So, let's see here. So, in case this is your first brush with my channel, and as I sort of started with my channel introduction, I started out life as a biological female, and that is still true to this day, and it will be true to the day I die, at least when this in this lifetime. However, I have taken and am still on doses of hormone replacement therapy with testosterone, and I've had a double mastectomy. And for anybody on the outside who does not know me, I generally pass and appear as a biological male. So I've had quite the opportunity to see both sides of the gender roles, the masculine role within society and the feminine role within society, and how we treat each other based on what we perceive is the sex of the other person we're interacting with. And so, because I didn't start this transition until I was around 30 or 31 years old, so the first uh, 30 30 years of my life was being raised and socialized as a biological female, and now being seen as opposite by anybody who didn't know me prior to that. So it's been a very interesting position that I occupy. And while we don't have children ourselves, and we don't plan to, there are definitely things that we notice are different about the way that we are raising kids, teaching kids, and treating one another without seeming that the instruction from parents about gender roles and expressions of masculinity and femininity. So, first of all, I would like to say that while in this topic of masculinity, we're going to be talking about mostly the far end of the spectrum of what we consider to be the pure masculine characteristics, but this does not mean that we believe anybody who is exhibiting any masculine characteristic must then exhibit all masculine characteristics, or that any characteristic that we give that label to is good or bad. It's neither. It's just simply our observation of what we believe to be masculinity. So, especially in the position that I'm in, I believe that it would be healthy as a society for us to begin accepting the gender nonconforming expressions of individuals. And I'm not saying to kowtow or bow to any kind of gender ideology or anything like that, simply to say that we can appreciate feminine males or masculine females, and those would be atypical in gender expression, only to say that we expect females to be feminine and we expect males to be masculine. That's not right or wrong, it's just the general trend of how people typically operate. So I think it would be useful for us to start with that premise that an appreciation of gender nonconforming people and that spectrum that each and every one of us has. No one is exclusively masculine or exclusively feminine. We all occupy that spectrum, some we each have our own unique combination of those characteristics.
I think it would be perhaps really helpful and healthy to put out the idea that every person quite possibly has several different layers to who they are as a person, especially when they begin to build awareness, self awareness. So, for example, there are physical expression preferences, and then there are the emotional layers. How does someone feel on the inside? How do they respond to stimuli emotionally? And then how do they express themselves emotionally? And then there are the mental processes and where that person lands on that spectrum of masculine to feminine or vice versa, and why, and then how that is all coming together within that person. And so, oh, here's a great example. For myself, um, I'm extremely feminine physically in how I present and how I prefer to present, but mentally, I'm considered extremely masculine. And emotionally, I seem to be almost right down the middle. And then on top of that, I am neurodivergent. So you may want to check out the beginning of the femininity stream at some point so that you can get more of an idea about how I process things. Because, as a heads up, I might say some pretty off the wall sounding stuff because of that neurodivergence and the way that I process things. And I just want everyone to know I don't mean to offend anyone. I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings or anything of that nature. Um, but that does tie into all of the masculinity and femininity talk. And I think that it might be helpful and healthy for people to begin to perhaps self reflect more on those levels and maybe suss out a little bit more of where they are each are coming from as a complete creature, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and even those characteristics can be changeable depending on certain situations. For example,
Right.
hormones make a huge difference in someone's behavior. What you thought might have been a very static or unchangeable characteristic within yourself is actually something that's being driven by a hormone. Um, which starts to then get into how much free will do we have when we're being controlled by a chemical within our bodies that seemingly we don't have control over.
Amen.
And that is, I actually did a live stream, or not a live stream, I did a video with Thick Goddess, a podcast that you can find a teaser on my channel and then a link to the actual podcast on that, which was a very interesting conversation as an aside. I think in order, though, to really get this conversation going, I'm going to just barrel right into, I think, something that has been a topic of conversation in the wider social sphere, which is the toxic masculinity, right? So people, I think, seeing that in the topic header may be sick and tired of that discussion because I've seen it used an awful lot to really put men down. You see it, I think, more in the liberal politics, as the quote unquote patriarchy. They'll hold that up and they'll parade out a lot of examples of male behavior that they'll further demonize. For example, we're gonna jump right in with the male gaze being a toxic masculine trait. Um, and I guess let me back up real quick. We're opening up here with talking about toxic masculinity and some of that. At some point here, we will be detailing and perhaps in dispersed within talking about these supposed toxic masculine traits, we'll be talking about what healthy masculinity might be, the flip side of that coin, or whether or not we even agree that a so-called toxic trait is indeed actually toxic. So, starting with the male gaze. So, for anybody that's perhaps not familiar with that, women have said that they feel predated upon by men who stare at them in public places. And of course, there are a lot of details that could go into contextual details that would potentially, change an opinion on that. But let's just say, for the sake of this conversation, that we are talking about men who perhaps linger just a little bit too long in casting their gaze upon a female that they find attractive, and that that woman then is offended by or feels predated upon by that male for this male gaze. And I've heard it labeled as toxic masculinity, that they are objectifying women in that way and that they feel it's something that should be stopped. And from my background of education through the evolutionary biology lens, it is a feature of the masculine to be attracted to things by visual design. So, men are in general very visual creatures, as in things that will catch their attention typically tend to be things that they find visually pleasing. And there are so many different ways that this can be exemplified. Um, but it's something that motivates men to do much of anything in some cases. And when you're talking about through that evolutionary biology lens, it's for reproductive purposes. So there are certain markers that they're looking at as far as, evolutionary beauty goes. I put that in quotes. So the Willendorf Venus, if you're familiar with, any of some of the most ancient artwork out there, the Willendorf Venus is supposed to be a fertility goddess who has very large breasts, very large hips, and those things we already know are signs of fertility. And that would be very attractive to a male who is interested in reproduction, which, whether or not he is consciously aware of that or not, most of them, I would say, on some subconscious level are. And so it's especially for me, I've noticed this actually since I was young, and especially since being on testosterone, that when I see something that I find beautiful, that doesn't necessarily have to be a female, but when I find something visually pleasing, I will definitely sit there and stare at it for a while. And females who exhibit those traditional markers of fertility, which a lot of men would associate then with beauty, whether they know it or not, will find that attractive and pleasing to look at. And I think that being on such a deeply rooted, programmed level to demonize such a thing, if indeed it is just perhaps a casual look and not anything more, to demonize something like that, I believe is extremely detrimental to men in general, because then that signals that we believe there is something inherently wrong with who they naturally are. And for anybody as a child who was ever, told that they were unlovable for any reason whatsoever that was out of their control would be able to relate to that being extremely crushing. And I think that's something that females, women in general, might have some sympathy and compassion for. From the flip side of that coin, it would be much like telling a woman that, her want to be a mother or be pregnant is, horrible. To demonize her for that when that's something that is innate within her. If that's a need or a want that she has, it's coming from, deep within her programming that's related to again, an evolutionary biology level. It goes back a long ways.
Or if, say, you don't want to be a mother and you're a woman, you can't relate, maybe you've been demonized for being feminine, for wanting to um, have your nails, your hair, your makeup looking really nice, and for putting time, effort, and resources into that. This also gets back into biology, and to shame the feminine for that maybe could be relatable. What do you think, though?
Sure. Yeah, it's just another example.
Hmm.
Um, uh, in a different way. I was in keeping it with the reproductive sense, though. The male gaze is
Oh,
something that is,
directly.
yeah, directly
Gotcha,
relatable.
gotcha.
But that's still a good example, just in general, of demonizing someone for something that they want, which, as far as I can tell, is fairly benign or can be kept fairly benign and is not within their conscious control. It's simply the way that they are. So, um, seeing that in this new age feminism demonizing men for that, specifically calling it toxic masculinity, that's just one reason of many, I think, that's contributing to things like the MGTOW movement, men going their own way. and in general, a lot of men being tired of attempting to have these relationships, especially with females who think that when they are being so harshly judged for such a feature of their biology. And now this can very easily snowball into somebody thinking that I'm justifying any action that comes after said male gaze. For example, unwanted sexual activity, we'll put it that way. And that's not at all what I'm saying. It doesn't justify anything beyond that point of simply just perhaps the wayward gaze or lingering for a few seconds. And that gets into the fact that we, as far as I can tell, don't seem to have any good masculine role models within society. And maybe I hope that within certain households that there are kids being raised with good masculine influences. Um, but what I don't see now at this crossroads where we're at is in teaching children how to deal with those evolutionary biology desires, that programming that is still there and as far as I can tell isn't going anywhere anytime soon, how to deal with that constructively, politely, respectfully in a society that we have today, which is not just input output based on, reproduction and survival. It's we are at, I believe, at the precipice of a type of conscientiousness, a type of consciousness, a type of awareness where we can exercise thought and control to some degree over those natural desires and drives that we have. And that's where I think today we could definitely use more of those masculine role models, whereas in ages past it was traditions of traditional gender roles, the rituals of going from childhood into adulthood, and we don't seem to have a whole lot of that. We're out of touch with that today. Did you have anything to add to that?
I agree. I agree.
Yeah,
I think you said it well enough, truthfully.
gotcha. So, oh, checking my notes here to see if there is anything on that particular topic that I would like to add. No, okay, so that actually segues into perhaps the next. Well, actually, let's talk about what some of the healthy masculinity might be as far as that male gaze is concerned. So certainly the toxic masculinity, labeling the male gaze toxic masculinity, I don't agree with at all. I don't believe that that's toxic masculinity. I believe that's masculinity, period. And what you do with that could be healthy or toxic. So, for example, if that gaze were then to be followed up with unwanted sexual advances and activity in that way, absolutely toxic masculinity in my opinion. That is imposing yourself or forcing yourself on someone without their consent, and the use of power or force in that way, in my opinion, or rather just the use of power and force, associating anything with physical exertion and force, that is in general a masculine pursuit, in general a masculine trait. I'm not saying that men have to do that in order to be masculine. I'm not saying that at all. Separating, sex from gender here, if that makes any sense.
You might want to explain that real quick for anyone who doesn't know.
Right. So so we have genders, as in my opinion, genders actually refer to masculine and feminine. I know that sex and gender are often used interchangeably. I did a video about that on my channel. Sex and gender are not the same, if you're interested in watching that, where I discuss that I believe sex is quite literally just referring to, male or female, as defined by what genitals you have, what chromosomes you have, and gender would be masculine or feminine. And that does not have to mean, it doesn't have to include anything relating to sex. It's just characteristics that are feminine and characteristics that are masculine. So, for example, characteristics that are masculine would be very goal oriented, um, visually stimulated, would also be you tend to like to use physical force to accomplish things. Um, what else, dear? Think of some other characteristics.
Sure. So, as far as masculinity goes, I would say that being talented with tools is another one. What do you think about that?
I would amend that to say your spatial awareness is, or your hand-eye coordination, and that just falls into physically oriented,
Oh, does it?
in my opinion. Yeah.
Okay, well, and I think personally that you've covered it
I know there are
nicely.
I know there are so many more
Oh,
characteristics, but
yeah.
that's just to give, empathy is not their strong suit. They tend to be more interested in things rather than
Yeah.
people. Um,
Yes.
and there's actually Dr. John Gray, who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. I think he does a great job of breaking down the difference between what he says are men and women, but really what I think that more is just the difference between masculine and feminine.
Hmm.
And it's just typical that females exhibit feminine traits and males exhibit masculine traits. And when I say typical,
Common.
yeah,
Common.
yeah, it's common.
Conventional.
Very, very
Hmm.
loose because again, everybody is on that spectrum within themselves, of masculine and feminine traits. So
I agree with you about what you said with his work, by the way.
yeah.
Yeah.
So where was I with that? So detailing. Okay, so the toxic masculine way of dealing with the male gaze would be to impose yourself sexually on somebody else then as a follow-up, and the healthy masculine in my opinion would then be to recognize, okay, I'm very interested in this person. I can tell, at least on this visual sexual level. I don't know much more about them, but I'm interested in following up with more because I like what I see from here, and I can do that respectfully by engaging this other person with polite requests for further interaction. So that would be and so the masculine is typically more associated with being the pursuer, and the feminine the pursued. At least as far as our biology is concerned, that's what it's geared towards. And so the healthy masculine way would be to do as I described. And these are things that, among so many others, are practices that are not being taught. And perhaps back in the maybe in the early part of the 20th century, with the whole and going back even further, the whole practice of courting, where you know send the lady lovely things and write her letters and woo her in that way, kind of like a bower bird with his nest.
Yeah, I was just thinking
Yeah,
about that.
yeah, so there's lots of tie-ins to the animal kingdom with this as well. But there are ways that with our eh, conscientiousness, with our awareness that we now seem to be coming to as a species, that we can apply these healthier characteristics for the society that we want, and the culture that we want. So, uh, so I was going into the next example of another interaction that occurs seemingly quite often, and an argument that I've actually seen around quite a bit in social media, which is an argument that New Age feminism and the whole sexual liberation movement would have you believe, which is that women should be allowed to wear whatever it is that they want to wear, wherever they want to wear it, without consideration for anybody who is watching around them. So I've seen it where women dress very, very provocatively in professional situations, let's just say in the office, for example, any offices of professional nature, or schools, public education, private education, whichever. I would consider all of that to be in the professional sphere. And they will dress in a way that's provocative. And by provocative, I mean wearing
Biologically provocative.
biologically
Yeah.
provocative, yes. Wearing clothes that accentuate certain areas that would be on display to indicate reproductive readiness. So
That's a
your
great way to put it.
your breasts, or your back end, anything that is nice and tight in that way.
Oh my god.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, right. Extra tight, clothing.
Yes.
Think of Kardashian in that way. So, and the women would say, the females would say that they should be allowed to wear that. however they please without having to worry, especially about that male gaze. And my first question to females would be, why do you wish to wear those clothings in the first place? And I would venture to guess that there'd be a lot of women who would perhaps try to say at first that they just like to wear provocative clothes, things that, you know, accentuate their body in a way that makes them feel proud. But why does it make them feel proud? And I think there hasn't been a whole lot of reflection on that question. And I think that if they reflected on it, they would realize that it makes them feel proud because they get attention. They get attention because of that whole reproductive biology thing within a lot of males, which is to look at that thing and to shower attention on that thing. And yet they'll say they don't want the male gaze. So they're kind of talking out both sides of their mouth, as far as I can tell. And it's, in my opinion, terribly disrespectful to the masculine people for them to dress that way in those settings, because I can tell you it is very distracting. It's not something that at least I have noticed is easy to help, at least not without a great deal of practice and compartmentalization.
Talk about discipline.
Yeah, it's a lot of discipline there, and as far as I can tell, it does seem like an abuse of power from women, because for the feminine, that is quite a bit of power that they hold in that way. And to be respectful of men by dressing in those less provocative ways would be a step in the direction of acknowledging that each of us have those, biological drivers, and we're doing our best to work with them. And to be respectful of others means to also not, aggravate those even further.
If I may, I've worked with a lot of people, and something when I've worked with women that keeps coming up is that some women don't feel powerful in their lives in other ways. And so I've been told that they dress sexually provocatively because it gives them social power. And some of the teaching and the counseling, you could say, that I provided has centered around finding ways to build humility and power hand in hand, especially from a biological point of view, because unfortunately, if women are only seeing themselves as having this type of power for the most part, I think then that places them even further into the mindset of essentially just being an animal
Sure. Yeah.
with a body, and that's where all of their power comes from. And I think that that's both very sad, inaccurate, and dangerous.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, and it fails to take into account this awareness and conscientiousness that I believe that we as a species are moving into, which is going beyond simply seeing everything through that lens. So, like you said, seeing that your power is only in your sexual appeal or in
Right.
reproduction or anything like that. And that's what I would say would be needed in a healthy feminine role model for today, which is to go beyond just that, seeing your value as a reproductive being, as a
Mm-hmm.
visually appealing being. And so that segues into then the masculine, what is their value beyond what it was before. So just for the
Like building houses and catching food.
right. So before, for the male, the masculine, it would have been, yes, the hunter, and the builder and the protector. And I think a lot of men today, while they do to some degree get some satisfaction out of that, because that is deeply buried within their biology, something that they are geared to do, I think that it is not wholly fulfilling anymore in this age of awareness and in this age of abundance that we're living in, because there is so much more now to life, than just that. It's not about just making a home, making a family, surviving, and then dying. It's more than that now. And so this, as I said, this segues into needing to acknowledge both those biological drivers and now what we can do in order to be healthy in our gender expressions with
Mhm.
this higher conscientiousness. So, and that actually leads me into talking about the what I think is an epidemic of males in the so okay, so who was that? Was it a Mr. Beast? Um yeah. It was one of Mr. Beast's staff members who went it was a I think his name was Chris
Ooh, I
who
know who you're talking about.
okay,
Yes,
so yeah,
you're right. It's Chris.
this epidemic of husbands or boyfriends or fathers or
Hmm.
any combination of those realizing or supposedly realizing that they are trans, that they want to be women or females, and then transitioning into that. And we see this social contagion among teenage girls. Abigail Schreier wrote about this, where there's a lot of young women who are transitioning, a lot of them inappropriately. It's not actually healthiest for them. And I also believe that now we're seeing this epidemic with males, but instead of them being young women, it's, males who are a little bit older, who already have a family or who are married, maybe with kids, that are claiming that they're trans.
They have serious social contracts, is what we're trying to say.
Yes. Yeah, that. I'm trying to give lots of
Oh,
examples.
okay. You
Um,
got this.
so, um, and I believe that, and this is just a theory, I don't have any proof because I've not talked to any of them, but I believe that perhaps a lot of these men who are transitioning, who are doing this, are doing so for one of two reasons, or maybe both. They were feminine men, or had more feminine characteristics than would have been previously socially accepted. They followed direction from their parents or from what they thought society wanted of them, got into a heteronormative relationship, had children, did the bit, and then realized that they feel stuck in these gender roles that were described of the past, as the father, as the husband, you're the breadwinner, you go out, you take care of things, and you father the children, and you sacrifice, yada yada yada, your feelings be damned kind of thing.
Hmm.
And maybe they wanted children, maybe they didn't, but they didn't that particular gender role route was not best for them. And being a feminine male, they see this opportunity to escape their responsibility. And poof, they're, trans woman, and they don't have to, be this thing that, previously they felt pigeonholed by. And so it's easier for them to accept the trans because they were feminine in the first place. And it's a way for them to drop that responsibility to escape. Um, and I see it a lot where men feel crushed by these expectations of some very very strict masculinity where we haven't quite updated in today's age what is a healthy way to express masculinity but also not to crush the femininity within any of these men.
Hmm.
How to find that balance. And like I said, of course, I can't be certain that that's what's happening with these trans individuals, but it could also be secondarily that they just want a way to escape responsibility. It could just quite literally be about escape
And
for
that they
them.
don't want to face any consequence,
Right? Yeah.
potentially.
Right.
And I would like to add, if I may, I've been doing some research on this for a while because I'm fascinated with the alternative sexuality community. Let's just call it. And there's a new trend of men who happen to think for whatever reason that they are transgender and or transsexual, so they're leaving their families, they're abandoning wives, housewives, and their little children or their young teenagers, and they're moving. Like, this one person moved overseas and he swore that he was trans, and then I think it was by year 2 of living in the UK, I believe it was, he decided that he actually wasn't trans and that he wanted to go off of the estrogen, and he did, and he stopped wearing the dresses and everything, and he's like, yeah, now I'm just living as a normal guy in the UK, and no, I'm not going to go back to America because I don't want to go back to my wife and to my kids, etc., etc. And I personally find that absolutely narcissistic, and I think that there is a lot of overlap there between narcissism and transgender and detrans and family abandonment, and it's been fascinating to me to watch these things unfold. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, and there's two things actually that relate to that. One of those is something that was just brought up in the chat by one of our viewers, which is that it seems as though a lot of transgender people who are doing things that are narcissistic in that nature are
Mm,
actually trans women, which, for anybody that doesn't
I've
know,
noticed that too.
that is a biological male who is posing as a female. And that you generally don't hear about trans masculine people or trans men, so that would be a biological female who appears as a biological male doing anything of that extremely narcissistic nature. So
Which, ironically, I find it really interesting that these so-called trans women are trying to bully and force their way into biological female spaces and the like, and they're saying, "Oh, I'm a woman, so treat me as such." But in their mistreatment of women and whatnot, they're actually, in my opinion, doing the most masculine and the manliest thing that they possibly could in competing and dominating.
in a toxic way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, and that's what I mean.
Yeah.
You're right. I should have said
Yeah,
that.
that would be a shining example of toxic
Yes.
masculinity being perpetrated by somebody who's actually impersonating femininity, which is so backwards it kind of makes my head hurt.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, and I've been fascinated with that, and it's been making my head hurt. And so some of these concepts for me are a little slippery, and I'm sorry if it comes off a little confusing. You're not stupid, you're not dumb, you're not crazy. It's literally me still trying to figure out how exactly to voice these slippery concepts that I've been um following for a while now.
Yeah. So yeah, that it's a very interesting thing that it seems as though the way that biological men who at least adopt being transgender for some period of time end up doing it for um, and displaying it in some very narcissistic ways. So, for example, the husband or father who is looking for a way to abandon his responsibility and become, feminine, and that's how he sees a way to do that. And I'm not saying that all trans women are that way. I know that there are some
Not at
that
all.
come out late in life who just that they were just very suppressed for a very long time, and they still are very much involved in their children's lives. I'm not talking about them.
Our hearts go out to those people.
Yeah, that's a very difficult situation that all around certainly. And no, I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about those who use transitioning as a way to get what it is that they want at the abandon of others, and in fact, perhaps often to the detriment of others, to the intrusion of others, depending on the context. And no, you don't see that being done by many, if at all, biological females who are um,
Trans.
trans, yes,
Mhm.
who are trans, such as myself. And it's very interesting to me that you don't see. So the reason that the the inappropriate reasons, we'll say, that someone might a female would transition early on in life would be due to things like sexual trauma. Oftentimes, is something that we're finding some kind of emotional, physical, or sexual trauma that was done to them, and so they're trying to distance themselves from the thing that they thought created their trauma versus what we're seeing in some of, older males who are transitioning. They're doing it, perhaps as a result of trauma, but in a more, what I would say, selfish way. And by that, I mean maybe they were led to believe or, forced into a position to, to perform a role that they really didn't want, and now they're using this, transitioning as an escape. So in some ways that it is a trauma response. However, it's an abandonment of their responsibility and everything else, and it's still, as far as I can tell, for a narcissistic reason, unfortunately.
And too, I'd like to add, we can see this in a lot of miserable marriages, even modern day, where men will unfortunately impregnate a woman or a young woman in their teen years, and they feel as though they quote unquote have to marry her and they have to be a husband and a father and whatnot, but they resent their life choices so much. They resent that female so much, and they feel as though they are entitled to cheat, then to lie, to deceive, and to cheat. And I've known many men exactly like this, where they think that they are great men because they're married to the woman and they're providing for the kids, but really they're not, because when people aren't looking, they're going and lying, betraying everything that they claim to stand for. And there just seems to be a lot of entitlement in toxic masculinity. I keep noticing, whether it's trans or the more common cheating scenario. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. And that, that sort of lack of empathy or narcissism, unfortunately, is something that is a little more associated with masculinity in general. And I wouldn't say that that's healthy. In fact, it might be more of a hallmark of the toxic masculinity. It's one thing to, lack empathy and then, be aware of that and do your best to offset that inability
Mm-hmm.
to be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes or consider somebody else to that extent, like what is more associated with the feminine or females. And it's another to simply allow that to, dictate your interactions with others with reckless abandon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that I would consider to be toxic masculinity. And there was an interview that I did with a gentleman named Gar, an Irish guy from, he has his own farm that he operates overseas, where he helps to rehabilitate juvenile delinquents and ex-cons, men who did not get that good, strong, masculine role model when they were younger, and they have a lot of those very strongly typical masculine features of being that lack of empathy, propensity towards aggression, physical expression in that way, very hard headed, I guess you could say. And he takes those men and those boys and he teaches them how to outlet that energy and that expression in a way that is as healthy as possible for themselves and for society, to integrate them back into society. And rather than demonizing them for the way that they are, he celebrates that and teaches them how to work with it. And that's something that I think is sorely lacking right now, leading to things like, convicts, young juvenile delinquents in that way, all the way up to these men who abandon their families and claim that they're trans to get away from it because they had children. Maybe they wanted them, maybe they didn't, but they were not, coached on how to deal with that strong sex drive that they had as a teenager, and ended up in that situation and then feeling like they were forced to go about it a certain way. And then, as my wife said, that builds resentment and will cause all kinds of nasty behaviors as a result of that. And we've not seemingly taught males in that situation how to take responsibility for it in a way that's healthiest for everybody that's now involved.
Right, right. And unfortunately, marriage and family, those aren't just personal matters, at least not in my eyes, because as within, so without, as above, so below, all of this adds up to a collective society. And the question that I would like to ask every human being in any society would be, what do you think about the society you live in? Further, do you think it's healthy? Do you think that it's happy? Why or why not? And for myself, if someone cannot respect the individual, which is indeed the ultimate minority in society, then there's no way, in my opinion, that they can respect the marriage, the family, and the society. And by respect, I don't mean bowing down to, I mean giving honesty to, giving discipline to, giving freedom to the individual. If we can't do that, then how can we do anything else in society? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It might be a little abstract, but I hope that it'll make sense.
Yeah. And further to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier in that
Mm-hmm.
was that something that we have to be aware of is that when I say this, I don't believe it, but I see evidence for it
Mm-hmm.
in that healthy isn't interesting. And so when I say that,
That's a great point.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean drama and trauma sells. So our, social role models and the things that, we watch
Mm-hmm.
in general, it's like a train wreck. And if you have that morbid curiosity, like a lot of people do, that draws you. It's very interesting for you to
Mm-hmm.
watch. And, the drama and trauma is something that even amongst ourselves, I feel like a lot of people don't realize that they are actually addicted to that because
I
in
agree.
in the absence of that chaos that then requires them to reflect on themselves, they do not
Yeah.
have a distraction anymore. And so this focus on trying to be healthy, what is healthy, in considering all of those questions that my wife asked you to ponder, that requires some pretty harsh introspection, perhaps on places where you have not been performing as well, and that then requires you to confront the ego, who would not wish to be wrong on any level, because that somehow is offensive to your existence. I did a video about that too. How we tend to defend our egos as if our lives depended on it, rather than wanting to admit any kind of fault. That video would be "Don't Get Woke, Wake Up: The Psychology of Being Offended." And that's something that's nothing new. It's something that Carl Jung and others have talked about. So we
And I'm so sorry to
no, go ahead.
interrupt you, honey.
Hmm.
Um, Artemis and I have both been through a lot of therapy and counseling because we love to learn about ourselves. We love learning new ways to think about ourselves and questions to ask. And something that we found fascinating that kept coming up with all of these different types of therapists, some of whom have been licensed for like 20 plus, 30 plus years, they, after a while of working with us, would say things like, I wish that more of my clients were like you, and this is why. And then they would be talking about how ego filled a lot of people are, to the point where therapists have each told us, I feel like I can't do my job, and I feel like I can't really truly help people because no one wants to admit that they're wrong in a lot of ways. And even myself, when I was younger, I was originally in a 4-year program to learn how to help people and rehabilitate them to rejoin society after severe familial trauma. And I quit after 2 years because my educators were telling me I can't get attached to any one of these people. I cannot expect anyone to make any meaningful promise or progress, because unfortunately these types of people that have been raised in the trauma and the drama, they don't ever want to admit that they are doing anything wrong, that they could do anything better, and they don't want to make any meaningful changes because what they're doing is already working for them, so why should they stop? And I think that if people can build more curiosity and humility, that that could solve a lot of societal ills. What do you think, honey?
Well, yeah, and it's certainly easier said than done. And I definitely wanted to make the disclaimer, own up to the fact that I definitely was not always that way. I was very much just like the average person prior to even just, let's just say, 5 years ago, where I didn't want to admit that I was wrong on much of anything and didn't realize how unconsciously I really was living. And
The ultimate autopilot.
yeah, yeah, the ultimate autopilot, which, you can argue might have been, a combination of both compartmentalizing a lot of my emotions and things like that from childhood, or the more masculine leaning that I just naturally am, which is, my strong suit is not to be empathetic and to be perhaps more um, erroneously confident. At least it was prior to getting married, prior to my wife, my lovely wife. No, I love that she did that. It sucked. It was incredibly painful, incredibly difficult in the beginning, and sometimes I wonder how I even made it to this point. Continued to keep going, but I did, and I'm very glad that I did. It's just not something to be taken lightly, and I don't know that there are very many people who really realize that and who actually conscientiously, put themselves through it. There may be people who are more, self-aware on that level just naturally. I was not. That was not my particular experience, my journey. And becoming more self-aware, becoming more humble, that's a great word, becoming more humble in that way,
Open-minded.
open-minded,
Mm-hmm.
was initially incredibly difficult for me, truth be told. However, now that I am on the other side of that, all of my naturally masculine traits, I believe, have been balanced out much more, instead of leaning that toxic masculine side. They are I'm able to take constructive criticism and build my natural strengths into something that is beneficial to both me and anybody that I interact with from, from a masculine perspective, because that's my strong suit. That's what some people might call, part of my gift, my set of tools that I can offer to people who are, in lack of those things, and vice versa. It would be the feminine that would have lots of things to offer and teach me to balance myself in that way. But
Mm-hmm.
on that note, uh, just becoming more self introspective, more humble, more open, more curious, less ego driven in that way, I think in general allows you then to take your natural inclination towards certain masculine or feminine traits and trade them from toxic versions into the healthy versions.
I think something too, maybe you don't give yourself enough credit for, at least in my view, is that you, from my experience, had been the worst of toxic feminine and the worst of toxic masculine, but now you, in my opinion, have empathy and you can see from both sides of the coin the healthy and the unhealthy of each, and I think that's a really valuable tool. So
Yep.
just some maybe some ego stroke in there for you.
Oh, yeah, much deserved, I guess.
So the Artemis, I would have described him before as a completely out of control Jack Russell Terrier. But now I see him more like a Saint Bernard.
Mm,
A
ah,
real chill Saint
oh,
Bernard.
that,
Ah,
ah. good example, I guess.
Oh, I hope so.
And I also still don't know how to take compliments, so
This is true.
that's nothing new.
If the camera was on, you'd see the red face, and it's glorious.
Yeah, yeah. So, all right. So, oh, let's see. I'm checking my notes here. Pardon my silence for a moment. I'm also reading through the chat to see things that we can potentially discuss
It looks like we've got some good stuff in
as
there.
further points. Um,
And Maverick, thank you for chiming in and for being here. We appreciate it. While he's reading, I'll just chatter a little bit. So, we decided to do this stream pretty much last moment. Otherwise, there would have been a lot more notification time. But we were looking at the calendar earlier today, and unfortunately, we weren't going to have any time between, I want to say, like now and maybe even August, because we've got a lot going, a lot of plates spinning, and we decided that it would be probably better and well overdue, anyways, for us to have the masculinity stream today instead of continuing to wait. Otherwise, we thought that maybe the gender topics would go a little stale, and we'd lose some momentum and interest here on the channel as far as the gender talk goes, and we didn't want to do that. We figured we'd made people wait long enough. Um,
okay. So, yeah.
awesome.
So, something else that I would like to bring up that might be a little bit of a tender spot for men in general, especially, let's just say, men or masculine people, males who, embody the traditional, masculine expression and masculine behavior, the idea of men as financial providers.
Great one.
So, this makes sense to me because of the trait of industriousness, that physical exertion that masculinity is typically known for. But just because someone can give more easily in that way doesn't mean that it entirely fulfills them, to be a provider in that way. And it gets a little tricky because if you believe in having a mother or a female individual at home to raise children, which I do believe is important for somebody, one of the parents to be around consistently for the child, for children, then she, her duties are within the home, and earning money is not something that she can very much be responsible for, because taking care of a child is her job. That is a full-time job. Um, and so it then kind of falls on the father or the masculine person to go out and be the breadwinner in that way. Or if you're talking about a relationship where it's non heteronormative, you at all times need to have someone at home with the child, in my opinion. So let's just say, I don't know, you have two men or two women that have, a surrogate child or adopted a child. Both of those parents can have a job, but for both of them to be away at the same time, for that child to be, in the care of somebody else, I would recommend that, being a very, very close and known family member versus something like a daycare, where that child is not getting, very close, intimate, one-on-one, undivided attention interaction. Um, so going back to, making men, the financial providers, some of them may have an identity, wrapped up in that, and they're okay with that. But it's been my suspicion, as I mentioned before, with men, claiming that they're transgender to escape that responsibility. Some of them get trapped into that situation where they're expected to provide more and more. Um, and if they've overextended themselves by having too many kids or a materially obsessed partner, they begin to tip that balance into unhealthy ranges and then get laid flat by their, quote unquote responsibility. And it's just a vicious cycle. Unable to have time for the things that actually fulfill them, they create resentment. And then again, we like what we talked about earlier with, cheating or abandoning or, any number of things, because it literally just breaks them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not condoning their behavior at that point. And I believe that they brought it on themselves to some extent, if it was from, unprotected sex or unplanned sex or just a poor choice in mate. But those things I think are forgivable to some extent because again, we're not being taught any of this, how to pick a good mate, how to work with our biological drives. We don't
Mhm.
have these really good masculine and feminine role models. And by really good, I mean just healthy ones. Um,
And love too. It seems to me like love, compassion, and empathy are not being taught as anything customizable and as anything truly valid and cherished.
yeah.
That's my opinion and my experience anyway.
Right, yeah. True appreciation for the roles that somebody else, within that relationship, your partner, performs. Whether they are masculine or feminine in nature, that's up to you and your partner to work out what um, what kind of cooperation you can both be happy with. And that's why I think, picking a mate in that dimension as well as so many others, like do you want children and what do you see, being as your life purpose, at this stage or another, aligning yourself in those ways as best as you possibly can. um Without that, it's so easy to see why these things happen.
And if I may, I think that the cure to a lot of relationship and interpersonal ills would be um, submission, actually, funny enough. And I know that that word usually has a really bad rap these days, but the way that I see it is that if each person came to each relationship with a heart of giving and submission to the other person, and then it seems to me like that would create heavenly relationships. And for myself, that's how I conduct all of my own relationships. And if someone does not meet me on that level, or they can't, or they don't want to for whatever reason, then I say, okay, and I wish them well, and I go about my life because otherwise, there's just a constant imbalance. And I hope that at some point human society can get to a level where relationships are not being founded on usury, you could say, for resources. I hope that it'll be more about seeing the other person in all of their layers and thoroughly loving the other person from the inside out, whether it's romantic, platonic, in business, family, friends, whatever it may be, just seeing that person, getting to know them truly deeply, and then um, working together to form a totally customized, permanent, hopefully, bond. And I think that that is, in my opinion anyway, the healthiest marriage model, especially. Um, I hope that that all makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, yeah, and through again, going back to the lens of evolutionary biology, um, you talk about utilitarian relationships. I think
Yes,
that was,
to utilitarian.
yeah, I think that
You're
was
right.
maybe Aristotle who outlined that initially. And forgive me if I'm wrong on that one, but that is something that is a hallmark, a feature of what I would consider to be less conscientious relationship making. Um,
I agree.
it's entirely based on resources and survival. It's um, base level consideration in that way. And by base level, I mean that's literally just about living and breathing and reproducing and nothing of joy or anything else beyond consideration beyond that. And that's still where I think a lot of people are thinking about others is in that um, utilitarian aspect, or at the very least from the sexual attraction aspect, which is still very, very primitive.
Very selfish.
And that is, I mean, the mechanism exists for a reason, certainly. I'm not here to demonize that, as this stream has hopefully demonstrated. It's something to be aware of, not to demonize, and to work with it. You might spy somebody from across the room that you find very, very interesting, and that maybe that person ends up being your lifelong companion because you're a perfect match, and you wouldn't have spotted them literally if it weren't for those visual markers that made you attracted in the first place.
Hmm.
But it's not the end all be all, and it's something just to one thing to take into consideration of the whole, um, decision making process and whether or not somebody you can make somebody happy and they can make you happy. And that's not a really good way to say it, because nobody can make you happy but you. That you can both add to each other's lives in a mm, struggling for a word here. You can add.
Oh, I disagree with what you're saying anyways, truthfully.
That's great.
Yeah.
So why? Okay, so
Oh.
I guess expand on that.
Why I just okay, I certainly do think that people and items and experiences and whatnot can actually make you happy. I simply think that it is a matter of finding what is on your you could say your vibration as to what brings you joy. Like making someone happy is the same in my opinion as bringing them joy.
Sure.
Do, do,
Yeah.
I, do I
Yeah.
do I bring you joy?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Sometimes.
Why? Yes, you do. Yes. As a
Okay.
matter of fact.
There you so
Um.
that I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's just, I guess what I meant to get at was that happiness. You have to. Happiness comes.
Like the core
Yes,
impact.
happiness comes from within for starters. If you are not happy as a person with yourself,
Yes.
forget it.
Yes.
You are probably not in the best place to be in a relationship because it's likely you will be looking to somebody else to fulfill that for you, and that is a recipe for disaster just about every time.
So do you think that it's safe to say in that there is a core happiness that one can only bring oneself, and then there is also external happiness?
Yes, the joy that you can get and the fulfillment that you can get from giving to others or receiving from others.
Right. And so that's why I disagree with you.
Okay, well, then yeah, it's so there's that clarification.
I rest my case.
That's great. um so all right. So another point that I would like to bring up, and this is we're kind of throwing back a little bit to the closer to the beginning of the conversation here when we were talking about the male gaze and the male appreciation for the aesthetic attraction of a female. And so I realize okay, so I realize a lot of this is really heteronormative, and somebody might find that rather ironic for someone like me who is so not heteronormative that it's ridiculous. But I'm saying this because even these core features still apply to the non-heteronormative with abandon for sex. Really, it doesn't the sex as in the male or female. So, for example, for me, even though I'm a biological female, I still exhibit that male gaze and that appreciation. I still have that programming for what is considered, an attractive female because I am sexually attracted to females. But again, I exhibit that male gaze just the same, despite being a biological female. And I would venture to guess that in general, you could say, applies to all masculine people who are, they find a visual appeal in, let's just say, females, not, well, yeah, a visual appeal in females and males too. It doesn't really matter because typically when you find males visually appealing, it's again for the same sexual reasons, reproductive fitness. You will find, musculature and a strong jaw and, those sorts of features to generally be attractive if you follow, that sort of evolutionary biology programming because that indicates reproductive fitness. But anyway, um, so this appreciation of the beauty of women, coming from men, it's a motivating factor for them. We talked about that. A reason why they choose to interact and do what they do is because that's the start of it in relationships, anyway. And I wanted to relate that back to something that I had experienced with myself, feedback that I had experienced for myself in my transition. So I in the videos that I posted of me going through with my top surgery and talking about the double mastectomy, the some of the men that I had built friendships with in my online presence, my channel, they had confided in me, and I'm so glad that they did because their opinion, their honest opinion in this way was priceless, precious to me. They had said that even though they were happy for me and knew me as a person, that I was much happier having gone through this procedure, that they had initially a knee-jerk response. They had initially felt, "What a shame," they said. "What a shame that, such a nice looking female body was destroyed. We lost a good one," which I mean,
Right.
I don't know. I don't know about that, but according to them and their visual appeal, that's what they had felt. And in some ways, they said that they were, kind of mourning that, which they even themselves found interesting, kind of, weird, awkward, to admit or to contemplate. But I think that awareness right there is a perfect example of, a male or, man, masculine person exercising that conscientiousness of, okay, I this primitive part of me, this evolutionary biology appreciates that, reproductive potential, but I can also and I can have those feelings of loss when, even though I wasn't going to be in relationship to it in any way and it doesn't affect me technically at all, I can appreciate those feelings and still be happy for someone else who, now having done that, can contribute to society in a meaningful way, just in a different way that wasn't, reproductively based. And, I had even gotten comments on that video from people like men that I didn't know, not attempting to spare my feelings at all for their opinion, which was to say, such a shame that, you've mutilated yourself in that way. And I actually did a video about that response. The video is, I think, overcoming objections to the transgender experience, where I dissect that sort of comment from a viewer and then my response as a result, which is basically um, what I just said to you here, which is that, you know I can understand it being sorrowful for men on that level. On the same token, I think one can, rise to the level of appreciating that other individual as a person and their contribution to society outside of their reproductive potential. Because not everybody is meant to or should reproduce. Um, because, one reason or another, whether they just would not be very attentive parents, perhaps they would be abusive or, abandoning in some way, or they just flat out don't want kids. Those would not be people that you would want to force in some way or pressure in some way to have a child. And so these men were acknowledging that very reality despite their, initial biological response to me switching sides, as they said, which I thought was was funny.
Well, honey, uh, you're saying like that you wouldn't want this or you wouldn't want that, but actually, I have run into people who do think that everyone, quote unquote, should want to have kids or should want this and should want that, and so actually they would.
Oh,
They would want to pressure you. I think I think that it's inaccurate to say that you wouldn't want this or you wouldn't want that. Like you as a person, you personally wouldn't want that, but for you to try to speak for someone else, I
oh,
don't think
I
that's
don't.
good.
I was gonna say I don't think that's what I meant, but
Mm,
maybe I misspoke.
I think you misspoke
Well,
wildly so.
yeah, well, this is why, generally I script all of my videos because, I don't want to misspeak in a line of thought, and sometimes I do. And so when I script my videos, I can be very, very sure of what it is exactly that I'm saying. So if somebody has a bone to pick with a comment or something that I've said, I can literally go back and read word for word what I said. And then perhaps if there was a misinterpretation, I could say that, or I can amend what I said without having to watch my entire video. So, no, certainly I agree that there are other people that would want to pressure everyone into having children because they think that that's some, duty of
Yeah.
all humans.
Yeah.
Certainly, I know some religions feel that way. I'm not going to call anyone out here. However, I know that that's one place where it happens quite frequently. So, um, yeah, I think in recognizing, allowing for the fact that, as with women, in what's becoming more an accepted thing that not all women, females, not women, females, not all females want to have children, and that's okay. As in, those females can have just as wonderful a place in society with their contributions without biologically reproducing. And I do believe that that's the very same extension that would be healthy to give to males in society. That not every male wants to reproduce, and neither is forcing that individual or expecting that individual to do so. Neither is that healthy. So I just don't think it's as widely talked about or accepted because generally speaking, people associate males with, rampant sexuality and reproduction and sowing their seeds and that sort of thing. And I know males that aren't like that at all. So it's just one of those things in the spectrum of, nonconformity, gender nonconformity that I think would be healthy and helpful to accept. So, and do you have anything to add to that point?
No, sir.
No. Okay. So we have here in the chat someone that has asked, or rather, they made the comment, drag queens, furries, and radical fetishists are not removed from the issue of, we'll say, narcissism in males pushing their identity, their ideologies
Mhm.
on others. And this person says all those individuals, as far as they can tell, have been male. Is there a middle ground gender expression and sexual expression? And so by middle ground, they mean an
Like a healthy.
appropriate,
Mhm.
a healthy, appropriate boundary. And so, yeah, I believe that there absolutely are healthy and appropriate boundaries for certain outcomes that are desired within society. And so that you have to first, in my opinion, you have to first define what are the consequences that you wish to see. Um, what are the parameters of the uh, the expression before you can kind of determine what that middle ground is. Because to imply something is middle or balanced or anything like that is a subjective judgment. And so,
Which a
um,
lot of this really is.
oh yeah, and pretty much all of it is.
Yeah, right.
um, so, uh, so yeah, you'd have to define what, what first, what from society you would want, and that gets into the real sticky situation that I feel we are in, also in this particular age in time, which is that there still exist many places in the world where that extremely aggressive, warlike expression of masculinity exists. The violence and, the complete disregard for other human life in the
Hmm.
face of resource acquisition, power, whatever goal they have chosen. And so, unfortunately, when you exist in a reality, in a place where you have those sorts of individuals, as far as I can tell, unless you are perfectly happy being, mowed over with machine gun, it's necessary to have other males who are willing to protect your society against that. And you could argue that living in the nuclear age that we do now, that a lot of that's been, you know, tampened down, but it's still very much there. There's still horrific bloodshed happening in plenty of areas of the world, nuclear warhead threat or not. And so to make a transition to a more peaceful society where there is a much more um, balanced expression of masculinity and femininity, as far as I can tell, is very tenuous, and I wouldn't pretend for a second that I would
Hmm.
know how to do that. It's not a position that I would envy anybody in trying to solve, or I should say, a position trying to occupy.
If I might, may I jump in?
Sure.
Okay. I wanted to say that I find it interesting that you point out about drag queens, furries, and radical fetishists, all male, because I have noticed that within the alternative sexuality group. So the the gays, the bisexual males, there seems to be a culture of extreme sexualization paired with low empathy for others, low compassion in general, and then low integrity, low morality, especially. And this happens a lot with men in general, I've seen, and of course it happens with women too, and lesbians and whatnot. But I keep noticing that it's far more aggressive in the gay and the bisexual male population. And then adding on to that, fetishes such as um, drag performing or interest in faux femininity and furries and BDSM, and then even sometimes getting into pedophilia or borderline pedophilia. It seems to me that there is a strong correlation between male high male sex drive and male aggressiveness, and that when you've got then these alternative sexuality aspects added onto it, it seems to me like a stirring pot of extreme narcissism in most cases. Just from what I've seen, from what I understand, and therefore, like for myself, I consider myself, even though I am queer, technically speaking, and married to a trans person, I do consider myself biphobic and homophobic in a lot of ways because I keep seeing these patterns crop up over and over and over again. And a lot of the time, it seems like it's being painted in society as being homophobic or transphobic, whatever it is, in a really hateful sense, to talk about these intersections of mental health, sexual addiction, gender expression, um, and the queer or alternative sexuality community. And it bothers me that it's such a taboo to talk about because now we have whole families suffering. We have individuals suffering too, certainly. And then all of that spreads out to become a societal sickness, in my opinion. There was a man named, ironically, Cass Mann. So his first name was Cass, Cass, and his last name was Mann. I think it was spelled with two N's, Mann, I think, but don't quote me on that. And he would talk about this openly in the gay man's scene overseas because this was like in the 80s and 90s. He's pointing out exactly what I'm talking about right now, except that he was in the sphere of trying to promote healthy, safer sex within the gay male community or the bi male community because most of these men, he himself said, were so focused on their own sexual desires that they could not put their own health or their own families, their own boyfriends, sexual conquests, and society's health above their addiction. And this led to many people fetishizing AIDS. That's called bug chasing. And if you want to go down a really dark rabbit hole, feel free to look that up. And that's a big part of why I consider myself bi and homophobic, especially when it comes to BDSM and when it comes to men. Um, do you have anything to add to that, honey?
Um, well, just that it is something of a natural inclination of biological programming feature for the male or masculine people to be more sexually driven in that way. They are, the pursuers as far as, reproductive strategy goes. And that follows, a lot of animals in the animal kingdom that, the men are the pursuers, and so they must have a sex drive high enough to interact with females despite, lots of potential rejections or danger, in many ways. And, oftentimes to the detriment of any kind of conscientious thought. In fact, I've heard a lot of guys talk about having, oh, having vagina on the brain. I'll just put it that way. And
Yeah.
that, they're literally just thinking with that, the head down in their pants and not the head up on their shoulders. And it's a real thing where that's driving behavior and not something to demonize. It's just there and something that, to the best of one's ability, if you're going to mentor young ones in, how to deal with that. And by young ones, I mean of, sexually active age and information that is age appropriate. That's very, subjective and interpretive, and I'm not going to try to define it otherwise. It's different for every child. But that's something that you have to keep in mind, and that is definitely a hallmark and a feature of either strong masculine minded people or of a lot of biological males. Um, and so I believe that that's why you often see a lot of the more sexualized features in biological males, like the trans women who are trans for autogynephilia, for example, or um, yeah, gosh, just or even so we actually occasionally watch Chris Hansen
Yes.
and all of his Predator Chronicles, getting pedophiles under in some trouble for their actions. And watching the interviews of some of these men, not all of them, some of them, they will literally say, I've watched your show before. I know this happens,
Hmm.
and I've thought these men are dogs, they're scum, they're sick, and yet they end up in the same position on the show and they can't seem to answer why it happens. And that's, to me, that is a fantastic example of that intersection between I can see some of these things maybe after the fact and after it's way too late, but I can see that this is what's going on. And yet I have this other practically beast within me that drives my behavior. It's so strong, this, sexual drive, that they do it to the detriment and to the lack of thought about the reasoning or the logic or anything for that matter. There's no other thought that happens, and I believe that that's in some cases what is happening with males who cheat within relationships. I'm not saying all, but it's just one potential answer of many, and I'm not excusing their behavior either by giving an explanation. It's simply a mechanism that I'm bringing out in an effort to throw some empathy towards these men, but still hold them accountable for their behavior in addressing it from a more healthy masculine perspective.
Yeah, it seems to me like men are a lot more likely to unfortunately fall back to their primitive animal state a lot more often than women when it comes to sex. At least some men, it seems to me, anyways. And I do feel sad for that because what if it doesn't have to be this way for a lot of these men? What if in early childhood, especially, and then the teenage years, with the right mentoring, the right care, the right instruction and guidance, they could be taught how to overcome those physical urges and become more than just an untamed sexual animal.
Right. And so I believe that that's something that we're missing in in our role models today for healthy masculinity is that we do not have anybody teaching that how to cooperate um, the different parts of themselves, that biological urge, that strong, primitive programming, and then the logical consideration, the empathy, the social consequences for that behavior, and moving forward, what that means for the rest of their lives, essentially, as far as they can see. So, um, there was something else that I was going to mention,
Hmm.
and now.
Poof,
Oh,
it's gone.
oh yes. Okay, so going back to trying to find that middle ground of, what the appropriate boundaries are for gender expression and sexual expression, and I mentioned that you would have to first define what sort of social conditions you want to see. I think that's difficult to try to say because again, when you need the traditional masculine male as a protector in a world where there are still plenty of men out there who are obsessed with, violence and warfare and power and control in that physical way, and then you also have parts of society that perhaps wish to really break away from that and not have to live within that constant, threat and activation in that way and would like to integrate more peacefully with one another, have, healthier gender, I shouldn't say healthier, have different gender roles that are more focused on, as my wife said, valuing the person for, who they are, not just through that utilitarian role, and celebrating the spectrum and celebrating difference and the creative things that people can bring as a result of being free to be who they naturally are at their healthiest level. And so I believe there's an expression, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Absolutely.
And uh, it's the role models that I would propose personally would be men. We're just talking about masculinity and men here. Um, would be men that know how to be warriors, that can step up and protect when necessary, but who also can appreciate the peaceful life that is, in absence of that warring situation.
And that they don't have to create their own drama and trauma, like a lot of men I think today they do.
Sure, and that gets into, one of the natural inclinations of masculinity, which is go forth, my son, and conquer. That feeling of fulfillment, that feeling of destiny, that feeling of mission, the goal-oriented aspect of, masculinity that I spoke of way earlier. It was a feature of masculinity. Finding purpose in in your life is something that finding that purpose that's also not at detriment to others' lives. So having empathy for others and then also finding that fulfillment and purpose without taking away from someone else the best you possibly can.
And maybe a really good physical hobby.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And because not all, masculine people, are super physical in their expression in that way. There are plenty
Mm-mm.
of them that prefer not to be, and that's totally fine. I'm just talking about, for those that enjoy masculinity in that particular form that, feel as though they need to go forth and conquer or build or something, do it in a way that's empathetic of others, not to somebody else's detriment. So don't be a Viking and go to the other village on, down the path or across the sea and, plunder and pillage and do have your way with the women and then come back and, say that you have done your adventure, you've done your part. Those days of that particular expression, as far as I can tell, are gone. We are not living in those days anymore. And so to find an outlet now for the masculine who wants some form of adventure in that way, there are ways that can be invented in order to accomplish that take into consideration the the lives of others. Um, in fact, to build something for someone else or like let's just say engineers for example. I know they don't physically build, the builders do, but creating something that other people can enjoy, this massive monument essentially to your ingenuity, I think is a fantastic example
Mhm.
of doing something like that is beneficial as far as I can tell to everybody involved. So um, Yeah, long way to answer that. At least from the masculine perspective, that's how I think the gender expression can be more balanced. And as far as the sexual expression to be more balanced, certainly teaching boys or masculine people how to gain control of their sexual urges while also fully acknowledging that they are a healthy aspect of their persona is I know that doesn't give a direct example, but that would be how I would lay it out. The example that I gave perhaps much earlier would be in that the whole male gaze, where you instead of you acknowledge that you are sexually attracted to the person for whom you are gazing at, and in interacting with that person, you know, asking them if they would, like to talk more, or if you can, buy them whatever such and such that you are, in the environment that you are there for. And rejection, gentlemen, is part of the game. There are going to be perhaps plenty of women that say, no, I'm a strong boss lady. I can do things myself. I don't need you. And at that moment, I can tell you, you may not want her either.
You might have just dodged a bullet.
Yeah, you may just have dodged a bullet in that way. And I'm not saying that, all boss ladies are terrible. That's not my point. My point is she's giving you the clear signal that she does not want to cooperate with you in that way, and that relationship may very much be one way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so if she's not interested, then that is, as I've once heard, rejection is protection, and not to take that personally.
Absolutely.
To within yourself be as confident in who you are as you can. Work through all of your personal baggage, your hangups, your feelings, lay it all out, talk to a therapist, get it straight. And so that your weaknesses are laid out for you to see. You can be aware of them and work with them and be confident in the person that you are. Be happy with yourself as yourself and alone. And when you look for somebody, you look for someone who can complement your life, not fill some kind of void. Um, Pardon the pun. um, so if that makes any sense.
And I think too that men and masculine people would be very well served to learn how to decide what type of um, lady companion they're looking for, anyways, and then to learn how to vet appropriately. Because it seems to me that a lot of society's sickness right now would be really resolved if people understood how to court, date, and vet according to what it is that they really truly deeply want. And you can't do that though if you don't know first what it is exactly that you want and or need.
Right. And that goes back to actually some of the introspective research that I did for myself. Granted, I did it after or rather not, maybe it wasn't after. It was around the time we got married, I think. Um
Uh
that I started to come across Dr. John Gray's work.
yes, that would have been
I can't
2019.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was just before or just after. Regardless, right around that time, I realized I was in deep doo doo because I didn't know what I was doing, and so I went and found his books, his research, his talks, and as I was listening, there's uh, in that I discovered what my natural inclinations were. So where in relationship to others anyway, where I naturally fell, where I was most comfortable, what sort of behaviors, thoughts I simply just naturally embodied. And in doing so, it helped me to figure out then exactly what I would want in a partner. Luckily, I chose well, thank God, with my wife. Otherwise, that would have been just another scenario among many divorces where people discover after marriage that the
Hmm.
person that they married was somebody that they married while they didn't know themselves, and they chose as a result of their unresolved traumas, attachment traumas, we'll
In
say.
my opinion, as you said earlier, the deepest of doo-doos,
Yes,
indeed.
yeah, the deepest of duties. So, I know there's a TED talk by somebody who talked about that. I think it's entitled something like "Why You Will Choose the Wrong Person to Marry,"
Yes, that's what it was.
something to that effect. Talks
Hmm.
about that specifically, and in another video that I would like to mention that's hilarious in my opinion is a video I think that's entitled "It's Not About the Nail."
Yes. Oh, I remember.
And this video will help you to understand in relationship which side of the masculine feminine spectrum you typically fall on. And I won't say anything more about the video other than that it was hilarious to me at the time and opened up a whole new world where I began to understand just where I stood and then what I could do with that in order to cooperate with my wife in good marriage and good relationship. So I would highly recommend that to anybody really, masculine, feminine, otherwise, to watch that so that they can get an impression and read up on and watch Dr. John Gray's videos to get an understanding of the masculine and feminine and their gender roles as they relate to each other. Because without that, if you do not have that understanding of, what particular combination of masculine and feminine you are, it will be very difficult for you to determine what sort of partner you are looking for, what you would be happy with. And that's what we were just talking about, where, vetting somebody, you can't vet somebody. Well, you can vet somebody, but you can vet them for the wrong criteria. And by wrong criteria, I mean criteria that's not going to make a lasting relationship for you.
Or a healthy one, or a happy
Yeah,
one.
healthy or happy, right.
Mm-mm.
So, um, understand that, let's just say if, you are, I'll just use me as an example because I can speak from experience. I don't like speaking for other people as much as I can think not to. Um, I know that I am happiest when I am able to, be largely out of the house and I'm, building, creating, working in that way. And I like my alone time. I like my self contemplation and research and logical reasoning. I like to do all of that in silence and in meditation. We have an agreement here in this house where when I go into my office and I shut the door, that unless someone is dying or the house is on fire, I am not to be disturbed until I come out. And this is nothing personal. It doesn't mean that I hate my wife or anything like that. It's simply that in order for me to be healthiest in my masculine leaning expression, that I need my alone time, and the feminine person that you are with needs to be able to accept that and support that. Um, so, things like that, if you know ahead of time that you're a more masculine person in that way, let's just say you get, with a feminine person who is not going to be understanding of that, who perhaps has not resolved any of their attachment trauma, is codependent, and constantly wants to be up your butt, so to speak, um, that is not going to result in a very healthy relationship because the person who needs the space is going to feel smothered and the person who wants the connection is going to feel abandoned. So, in knowing and resolving your own attachment trauma and in knowing what where on the spectrums of masculinity and femininity you are, you can find someone who is a natural complement to that. And so somebody who is more industrious and wanting that sort of alone time will probably do pretty well with, either an traditional feminine person who, is nurturing and caretaking, but can also respect boundaries in that way, office boundaries, for example. Or maybe somebody who is also like them in, liking their alone time, and they're not offended if either one takes, their alone time. So you might see two masculine people together that work very well together, and they may not have a lot of traditional romantic love, but they have a good relationship for them. They're happy with that. And you wouldn't be able to do that, match that up, if you didn't know what your own, you know, particular gender expression was somewhere between masculine and feminine, your own unique combination. So,
I agree.
yeah. So, um, in the chat, I don't believe. Oh, we did have a comment here in the chat that was a very interesting observation, and I do want to kind of talk about it a little bit, at least from any kind of experience that I have with it.
I must have missed it. Can you read it?
That this individual said, for reproductive efficiency, men often need to dissociate in order to perform. Men
Really?
are practically hypnotized by erotic stimulation and can dissociate while always seeking a stronger climax. So I did not read
Oh, wow.
those messages in order, but those were the messages that were sent. So I am very much aware of that whole dissociative
Hmm.
aspect of performance. In fact, when watching pornography, for example, um, I have often heard men say that they put themselves in the shoes of the guy that's in the porn. Let's just assume it's a normal heterosexual pornography. That the man can put himself in the shoes of the other male in the video, and dissociate from the fact that he's just sitting in front of a screen, and pretend that he is participating in that video that he's watching. So there is that element of imagination that is occurring, and I have heard and experienced, actually, males who have not been able to keep an erection because of something, that they are emotionally bothered by. So if they are unable to dissociate from those things, and just basically embody the very primitive reproductive response of get the erection and ejaculate, that's if they can't do that, then they will lose the erection, and they can't actually have sex. So that is something that I think is it's embarrassing for a lot of men to talk about, because that inability to keep an erection for emotional reasons is, as far as I can tell, still kind of taboo to talk about in society and culture, because it's very emasculating that you can't, keep an erection, according to society. And it's not considered the emotional health of that male who's having that problem. And I think that's where we as a society, or masculine role models in general, can absolutely improve and step up in helping men with that issue, because to get in touch with, in order, in my opinion, in order to be a healthy masculine individual, you have to acknowledge and get in touch with your feminine side in that way. And I know there's been a lot of memes, about men getting in touch with their feminine side, in ways that are silly, really. I don't know, donning a dress, or, putting nail polish on, or something like that. What I mean by getting in touch with the feminine side is actually empathizing with, yourself, your feelings,
Hmm.
really getting into those feelings that are oftentimes compartmentalized or dissociated from, with men, because again, society's just not been very accepting of that. And I'm not saying, to be whiny and complaining and sit and stew in victimhood. That's not the same thing at all. Um, Instead, it would be simply to say, I feel inadequate in this way, or this thing is bothering me, and as a result, I just can't perform sexually because of it. Um, and that's something to give space for and pay attention to, and help with, acknowledge that, as part of being, a healthy masculine individual.
And I'd like to say I find it a little sad and strange that for women, if there are sexual dysfunction issues or climactic issues, it seems to me that society is a lot more geared towards empathy and helping them sort that out, but it doesn't seem like beyond popping a blue pill that men get a lot of empathy or care for these types of things. And I don't like that double standard personally. That really bothers me. What do you think though?
Yeah, I agree. And there's definitely a double standard there as far as that's concerned. And that's something that females in general can. Okay, so what I would think would be an unconscious, unaware, unconscientious female thing to do would be to um, deride the male that she's in a relationship with for the lack of ability to keep an erection, especially if it's, for something emotional, because the primitive reasoning for that would be, oh, you are an inadequate male because you cannot reproduce. Um, to take, that, to be aware of that, because women are potentially on some level going to feel that, oh, you can't keep it up, then this is disappointing. Look, I get it, that is definitely a valid emotion to experience. I will sympathize with that.
Now, let's not let some shrinkage ruin our fun.
Right, yeah. Oh, by the way, goodness, so that I'll say that for just a minute. Some children's shows, the gems of adult humor in there. I was just for background noise was listening to some old Magic School Bus episodes,
Mm.
and when
Mm-hmm.
Miss Frizzle said, can't let a little shrinkage ruin our day. I stopped what I was doing dead and thought, no. She didn't just say that. There's no reason for a child to benefit from that. That is absolutely for the adult watching that show to chuckle at. But anyway,
Some of these
so
so-called children's shows I don't think are children's
yeah,
shows.
well, Disney has a huge history of
Mm.
that, but that's not
Mm-mm.
that's not for this live stream. That's for another video actually coming up.
Right.
But stay tuned for that video on
Nice plug.
yeah. So, anyway, I think that's a place where women, females, can integrate that conscientiousness, the awareness of their primitive feeling of, okay, that's disappointing. The erection isn't, happening, and you're somehow a dysfunctional male, can bridge that gap into having empathy for that male and then supporting him in whatever the reasoning may be. And his end of the bargain is not to descend into victimhood and excuses and whining and complaining, to actually solve the problem, take responsibility and solve the problem and do the self introspection, and then be brave enough to admit it. And gentlemen, you may be in a relationship with a woman who, perhaps you come across this information quite late, and you chose a woman who is perhaps not healthiest for you, and she may ridicule you for that. In my opinion, that's a really bad sign, and perhaps either a new partner is in order, or addressing that with your partner for them to address and give them an opportunity to rectify that, because I don't believe that sort of ridicule and then leaving it at, no empathy is healthy at all.
Well, that's where we get into talking about abuse,
Right.
emotional abuse,
Yeah.
verbal abuse, and a lot of men are victims and survivors of domestic violence in many different ways at the hands of women. And in my opinion, it really deserves a lot more focus and attention that it gets because if a guy can't have a healthy sex life with one woman but he can with another, it might be worth looking into because he may be having a completely different emotional response to one versus the other because the one is actually connecting and empathizing with him on an emotional level that a narcissist, a borderline, or someone who is just unfortunately toxic because of general abuse that they've suffered, they're never going to be able to offer as a partner. And in my opinion, that's tragic because love can certainly be there, but if a person is unhealthy or abusive, they're never going to be able to really and truly express those emotions and have that type of connection. So why would a man feel safe and be able to perform?
Yeah. So, much like I believe emotions and feelings are markers for us to pay attention to something in our lives that needs further introspection, that needs further research, further addressing, further looking into. Gentlemen, you have an additional tool that may be of use to you, and that is your weather stick.
That is correct.
If it's not working, it may not be something medical. It could be something that is emotional in nature and needs addressing in that way. Don't reach for the Viagra right away. It could be something emotional, or maybe lay off the Mountain Dew. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but in either case, you have that potential, additional marker, something else to look at that is indicating that there there is more to be resolved. So, um, or in in your partner, perhaps something that is displeasing in your partner, a red flag within them of, as my wife said, some abuse. So,
Or it could just be that you guys are emotionally incompatible, and that's okay too,
yeah,
I think.
yeah, right. Yeah, to admit that, especially if you've been doing a lot of this introspection after the fact, which unfortunately, again, because we lack the wider institutionalized education on learning about ourselves, and I do believe, call this conspiracy theory if you will, but I do believe that that is by design, that a lot of these public institutional places are purposefully not teaching any of the inner work, psychology, emotional self-regulation, none of that. They're not doing mental and emotional health because it's much easier to control people who are unaware and confused, who are constantly dealing with tire fires and train wrecks and are consistently seeking the next high because they have a lot of inner turmoil and are in chaos all the time.
And then we have reality TV,
Well, yeah.
and then they monetize it.
Yeah,
So,
right. So it's and because again, like, humans can be morbid creatures and we do like to watch that sort of thing. But again, what you surround yourself with, what you consume, remember what you put on your body is it does affect you. It will be exhibited in other aspects of your life. So that is, I believe, a level of awareness that still is. I mean, it's starting to come around, and it's not just food. It's all types of consumption, whether that be media, um, and other plenty of other areas. So, um, yeah. So I think. Oh yes. So here in the chat, here is another comment and something that I agree with. This individual says that the most useful content I've read exploring the masculine feminine balance in each individual involves works by Carl Jung on the anima animus. And that, thank you, Matthew, for saying that. I'm not sure if you were here for earlier in the stream, but along with Dr. John Gray's work, who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and then the follow-up book he wrote, I also mentioned Carl Jung because I agree with you 100% that the integration of the shadow, as he calls it, is the key. And I believe that a part of what Carl Jung was talking about when he's talking about integrating the shadow is absolutely that anima animus, the primitive aspects of our behavior that are induced, run by the programming from our evolution. And so, evolutionary biology, that our behavior is directed by the goal of reproducing and staving off um, death as long as possible. So, that is a part of us that exists and not something to demonize, instead, something to be aware of and, as he says, integrate into our higher levels of consciousness. The shadow, I believe, also can be describing our trauma personas. And I believe, honestly, that no matter how good of an upbringing you had, there will be some types of trauma that you've had in your childhood, because that's just something that exists here. It is unavoidable. If it wasn't from In some bits from your parents, it would have been from other family members or other people in your social circle, at school, in public in general. It's
Teachers too.
teachers.
Mm-hmm.
It's, as far as I can tell, it's unavoidable. Not all of it is purposeful at all, I
Mm-hmm.
believe. A lot of it can happen as well from just unconscious behavior. People on autopilot because of their own suffering. It's still something that happens. So integrating of the shadow self in that way is integrating and um, resolving your trauma from your formative years, the years in which you are being programmed. Your brain is soaking up everything that it can about the world so that it can go and operate as successfully as it thinks is possible based on the experiences that it has. It takes those experiences as doctrine; they must be truth. And you may find out, later in life when you experience other things, if you get a chance to travel and see other places in the world and get into other cultures, other socioeconomic statuses, that those experiences and therefore perhaps those formative views would be very, very different. And that gets into then what is reality, which is a whole other discussion, certainly not for this stream. But that's part of becoming a healthy masculine or feminine, or combination of the two, individual, is in understanding those things. So this is, the integration of the shadow self. That's irrespective of gender roles. That's just for a healthier individual. And, masculinity and femininity are just features of that. So, pardon me, I am parched. Mm. So, I believe that covers everything that's been in the chat so far. Do you have anything that you would like to add for
No,
this stream in particular?
not anything coming to mind right now.
Okay. So I've got two things here. How did I forget those? All
Oh
right.
no.
So one one phrase that often gets thrown around, and I've seen videos, of influencers on YouTube trying to grift off of this, or give their own version for clicks on what they think an alpha male is or how to be an alpha male.
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as I can tell, the expression of alpha male is lifted from talking about the animal kingdom, where there's a hierarchy within a social species. So, for example, the wolf, that's a lot of people will probably know that one, I would guess, where the pack of wolves is directed by the alpha male and the alpha female. They are the two that do the reproducing, that do the direction of hunting. They basically tell the pack what's up, what they're gonna do, and so I've seen influencers talk about, the alpha male then as being the dominating male, the male that has the power, the control, the women, the money, the rich, all these things, supposedly that the healthy masculine wants. And when they talk about it, I don't know if any of you who are listening to this are familiar with um, brainwave states. So there's been quite a bit of study and research into different brainwave states. So there's alpha, beta, delta, and theta, as far as I know. And in each of these brainwave states, they have different characteristics that they're known for. So the and then there's gamma. Um, and so the alpha brainwave state is typically associated with a very relaxed and um, grounded or stable behavior and thought. So not a lot of manic behavior or thoughts. Certainly things like aggression or fear. None of those occur in alpha. That is what you might consider like a natural resting brain state, if I'm recalling properly. And the beta brain state is associated with the fight, flight, freeze, or periods of intense physical activity. There's not usually a whole lot of learning going on in that state. It tends to be more autopiloted and quite primitive. And in fact, there have been lots of studies that show that the if somebody is spending a lot of time chronically in the beta brain state, that it will cause issues with mental and emotional health, and even will lead to things like chronic diseases, autoimmune diseases, and things like that when people get stuck in that beta brainwave state. And that happens from chronic abuse and trauma or unresolved trauma. And so you'll find therapies out there that involve polyvagal theory. I'm throwing some of these things out there. I won't talk about them in depth here in this stream, but you can look them up if you're interested. Highly recommend. Um, Polyvagal theory and work that's been done by like Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who wrote, I think, a book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, talks about how how to keep oneself out of that highly aroused state, that extremely stressed state, as a conscientious individual, as a conscientious being, unlike a lot of animals who go into that beta brainwave state when there's a threat, and then they can exit that because they don't have the sentience or the conscientiousness to contemplate their potential future date of death, like we do as humans. So Sapolsky did work on that, as well as work by Dr. Feldenkrais, who talks about somatic experiencing therapy. Dr. Peter Levine, who wrote Waking the Tiger, also very good on that. Anyway, so that's all on how to get yourself unstuck from the beta brainwave state. But that beta state is associated with that hyper aggression, hyper fight, what you might say, what people have associated with hyper alpha male. And I find that ironic because when people influencers will talk about being an alpha male, they sometimes will talk about being in that a super macho state, which actually is beta. It's a in the chain of hierarchy, it's lesser than what alpha actually is, which is somebody who is not being driven by that fight, flight, freeze, extreme chronic stress, aggression type state or
And
fear.
they're not emotionally triggered. Sorry, honey.
Thank you. Yes, that's what I'm trying to get at. Is that they're not and I've said about a million words where those would have done. Yes, emotionally triggered. Um, they're not in that emotionally triggered state. They're not concerned with defending their egos or appearing to be a strong masculine individual because they just are.
Mm-hmm.
The alpha just is. They're not trying to prove that to anybody. They simply exude that natural calm stability and strength, what you might call majesty.
Can I jump in here?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Please do.
So for myself, I married Artemis, clearly, and his family is interesting, to say the least. Personally, I think that there are some psychopaths, malignant narcissists, things like that going on. And one time I was dragged into a family quote unquote meeting after his family had been abusing me for quite a while. And one of his sisters had actually chased me and cornered me in the bedroom. And when it came time for the father, the patriarch of the family, to ask me what was going on, what I thought if I had anything to say, I said that I felt afraid and concerned because one of his daughters had chased me and cornered me. And this man, who, how tall is he?
He's over 6 foot. Yeah.
Yeah, alright, so Artemis's dad is well over 6 foot. Me, I'm like 5'3". And instead of handling it calmly, the feedback that I was giving, which I didn't say anything aggressive. I just said, hey, this thing happened. I feel afraid. I feel much lesser than, and I am consistently stressed. He didn't even let me get out more than just saying that I was upset by the fact that his daughter did this. He stood up in the middle of this family meeting. He's the only guy. And he starts raging at me from across the room. I'm sitting here half my height because I am only like 5'3" and he's well over 6 foot. He stands up to his full height and he starts screaming, raging, cursing at me, and just absolutely loses his stack. And it terrified me into submission. But I realized within myself at that point, one, I'm never going to respect this male, this man ever again because he's a liar. He's a serial liar, he's a serial cheater and manipulator. And now I also view him as a complete man child because he can't handle any kind of dissent without blowing up into a gorilla like state from my point of view at that point. And he's a complete hypocrite because if I had done that to any of his kids, he and his wife probably would have absolutely lost it. But it was perfectly okay for one of their kids to do that to me and much worse. So, this is my own experience with the so called alpha male. Anytime any guy tries to put forth any type of facade where they're tough and they know what they're talking about and they present all of their opinions as facts and they try to tell you how you should think, how you should feel, how you should act, this and that, they're not an alpha male, a true alpha male. That person is as beta as the summer Florida day is long. And I would say run. Just absolutely run. Because men who are in any kind of beta existence, talking about the brainwaves, they literally are in such a fight, flight, or freeze emotional point most of the time that you can't reason with these people. You can't talk sense into them. You can't voice your opinion, your concerns, introduce other types of logic because they are too afraid and they can't handle any kind of threat to the ego or to their way of life or to the resources that they've gathered for themselves, whether fairly or not. And therefore, good luck cracking under that shell. And I've come to realize that the people, especially the men that I respect most, usually have the calmest, quietest demeanors in general, and they just have an air of peace. When they speak in a way that delineates between their own opinions and what they can prove to be facts as much as possible. They are kind and considerate as possible, and they don't speak over other people. They especially don't scream. They don't rage. They don't rant and verbally hold people hostage. So maybe just some red flags to consider.
Yeah, and it's something to keep in mind that, and not excusing this behavior at all, simply delineating some empathy and sympathy. Someone like that could be exhibiting that behavior due to their own
Mhm.
traumas, unresolved traumas, and it's a really unfortunate and sad situation that that happens. And the best that I think one can hope for is that that individual at some point realizes that that's what's happening and that they get themselves out of, that beta state for their own health and everybody else around them. And they learn that, to be a strong individual, you need not to control others with any kind of brute force, whether that be, raising your voice or cursing or,
Or
being
manipulation.
manipulating,
Hmm.
being physical, really in any way, shape, or form, that the strong individual, whether masculine or feminine, does not seek to manipulate somebody else, period, by any means. Um, by any subverting means in that way, by any tyrannical means, by imposing in that way. Their sense of self and security is not threatened by somebody else's differing opinion, and certainly not by any of their criticism. They can take constructive criticism or and or they can actually learn to distinguish what constructive criticism actually is versus someone who's just being, verbally abusive or ad hominem attack or whatever criticism they have is simply a projection or reflection of their own trauma, or, troubles. So
I agree.
that takes in my opinion, a tremendous amount of self-awareness as well as an understanding of others. And it's taken me the better part of 5 or 6 years now at this point to to accomplish both of those things. Untangle all my own internal stuff, and then understand other people's, and how to be um, healthier in interacting with others, especially others who are not yet on that level, because that will take a tremendous toll if you have to consistently deal with people like that. Which is why, again, controlling what you are consuming, who you are around, is another part of that consumption. And it's difficult, I think, for people who come to this kind of level. Carl Jung spoke about this as well in one of his essays. I forget which one that it was. I started listening to it. Somebody did a reading of it on YouTube where he talks about it being, lonely as the conscientious man, or the
Hmm.
modern, I think he called it the modern man. I believe he called it modern man. Don't quote me, but I do believe it was something to that effect, that once you reach that level of understanding, then um, to then be without the constant supply of social interaction that you had enjoyed on those lower levels of awareness can be lonely at first. It's a big change. Um, or it can feel lonely, I should say. It depends then how you look at, your relationships and the quality of them from that point moving forward.
By
Um,
comparison, though, technically speaking, it is lonely,
yeah,
like alone.
you're right. Yeah, yeah. In that way, it
Hmm.
by literal definition,
Hmm.
yes, it is. It can absolutely be. And I know that I probably would have struggled had it not been for my wife being around to help me understand that, and to some degree, deal with my crap for a while there, which terrible. Um, was I'm forever grateful for having that mirror and that support at the same time, for my own BS. So
Right. And by the way, friends, 0 out of 10, please do not ever engage in a toxic relationship. It almost killed me. And I think that if we hadn't moved out of state, uh, I would have been on the nightly news at one point. Just another Gabby Petito, because his family absolutely hated me for no reason, to the point where one of his sisters was sending me essentially death threats via text message, spurred on by his mom and potentially also his father. And they basically harassed him into psychopathically controlling every aspect of my life, everything that I ate, drank, did, where I went, the friends that I had, the clothing that I wore, how I wore my hair, my makeup. His mother manipulated him into taking away money for nutritional care that I desperately needed to stay alive. And I was working full-time jobs on top of cleaning the house, taking care of the house, cooking, baking, catering to him and to his toxic, ungrateful family, and hauling laundry up 3 flights of stairs and caring for what, like 11 dogs at a time from his family. So it might seem like, oh, I'm just gonna go on a date with this person and see how it goes. Okay, yeah, they lied to me. They cheated on me once, or they cheated on their ex, or all of their exes are quote unquote crazy. But one red flag quickly will mount to a million, and you may not realize that you're getting into something that you really might not understand. And had you just heeded the first or the second red flag, you'd save yourself a lot of happiness and health and time and other resources that you may never ever get back. Our story is, quite frankly, I think, one in a trillion, maybe just once upon a time, and we never ever endorse anyone getting into or staying into any type of toxic relationship. And that could be you being the toxic person or being on the receiving end of the toxicity. We just don't support any of that. And we are um, incredibly huge fans of getting psychological care. Do you have
Yeah.
anything to add?
Um, yeah, outside of the fact that, I mean, depending on what those red flags are, I mean, I think there's a spectrum of
I agree.
of severity of red flags, and I don't necessarily agree that, one red flag means that it'll turn into a trillion more.
No, no, no. That's why I said cheating and stuff
No, okay,
specifically.
okay, okay. Then I
Yeah,
missed it. But
that's okay.
yeah. So outside of that, yeah, the best bet is to simply orient yourself, get straight within yourself, fix your traumas, your baggage, heal from that. Keep out of those relationships while you do that. And if you believe in law of attraction and vibrational attraction, that when you are literally, your brain waves are no longer in beta and you're in, alpha more of the time, that you will be able to, attract and see other people who are on that same wavelength, and the relationship will be probably a much better, healthier match, for the both of you at that point. But I believe that a lot of these high trauma, high drama relationships and all the horror stories that you hear are occurring because those individuals that engage in that are still in beta because they haven't healed from their traumas. Um, and therefore, imagine, two train wrecks meeting.
Good.
I mean, that's what do you expect? It's going to be explosive. Might make for some interesting television, but you don't want to be living it, I would imagine. Unless you do, and in which case, this is a free world. Have at it. It would not.
Some people do want to.
Yeah, it would
Mm.
not be my recommendation. At least if you're listening to this stream, it's maybe not something that you would want either. So,
Many hurt people hurt people.
yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So, um, another thing, not that I want to end on this stream, but this is one of the last things that I have in my notes, um, is the the fact that something that I've noticed that's been talked about is this what is it, Japanese, I think, a type of Japanese porn called yaoi and
Yeah.
uri, or yaoi and yuri. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna butcher that. Um, and this type of pornography that straight women are watching because it's from what I understand, it's gay porn. It's man on man, male on male, but it's very sensual, very romantic in nature. It's very soft. It's not the hardcore type porn that you might see some other heterosexual porn videos to be about. Aggressive, raw animal type behavior that some males like or some people like. Um, but this, yaoi pornography is something being watched by a lot of cis women because it embodies a type of relationship that they wish that they, on some level, could have with their masculine partner. So something that's a little more, sensitive, a little more emotional. Um, and in that case, uh, I would say it's beneficial for men to get in touch with their feminine side because then they could be much more fulfilling to their female partners. And I mean, this is,
And you'll get laid more.
and you'll get laid more. More than likely, you'll get laid more. Yeah. And this is something this is not new. John Gray talks about this, and how to speak that love language to women. It may not come as naturally to you as it does to females, being perhaps not as in tune with your empathy or empathetic side. Um, but that's just part of a healthy relationship, is in indulging in the other's needs when it comes to that. Um,
Yeah, that goes right back to the submission that I was talking about, mutual submission.
yeah. So yeah, and of course that the typical heterosexual porn that's very raw and animalistic in nature. If anything, that could be leading to what people are calling a rape culture due to its focus on that toxic masculinity. And I'm not saying that raw animalistic sex is terrible in all of its forms. It's not. It just needs to be consensual. And that's another thing that without good masculine role models to these young people who are seeing and are being exposed to any of this, type of media, which, despite your best parental controls, is still something that it's possible your child's going to gain access to, and it needs to be talked about, at the very least, and how to accommodate consensual enactment of said behavior at the appropriate time. That's very difficult to do. However, again, that's one place where I think the uh, the lack of role models and instead access to that sort of thing is detrimental to this synthesis of the animalistic side and the higher conscientiousness, the higher I keep saying conscientiousness, the higher consciousness. Would that be what I'm trying to say?
Hmm.
I don't know. It could be either or, but I think you get my point.
I think so. I think you did a fair enough job.
Yeah.
You?
So yeah,
Yeah.
and that relates actually on a tangential side note here. Um, I believe that straight women watching that yaoi pornography, um, and then transitioning, some of them then doing a gender transition to be male because they think betting
Hmm.
a or having sex with a gay male will be a lot more along their lines of preferred romantic sexual encounter are sorely mistaken. And I'm not
Hmm.
saying adult females do this, but this could be something that a sexually active but young female could be thinking, that she's very drawn to that sort of thing and thinks that a gay man is going to be the best way to get that because none of the other heterosexual men or males around her are exhibiting any kind of sensitivity to the feminine, and so she'll transition, or try to transition, find out that it's a disaster for her,
Right.
and also not realizing that gay men don't want you if you don't have the right parts to begin with, and that's not something that you can change. Even with phalloplasties, which are incredibly risky
Hmm.
and are still not natural, and that gets into the whole super straight movement, people preferring their sexuality being based on genitals. That's another evolutionary biology feature, that is a sexuality that is in ground, programmed, and not going to change. I don't care what trans woman says that her fake box is, the Louis Vuitton compared to a natural vagina. I've heard that said, and I find it deplorable.
And I agree. I think it's
Um,
horrible and inaccurate.
Yeah, I think they say that so that they can feel better. Again, that's that whole
Hmm.
narcissistic bend to those individuals.
Right.
They
I'm better than the natural born woman
right,
attitude.
yeah.
Hmm.
And not all trans women are that way. I will say that. I know a few trans women online who are not that way at all. So please don't read that I think all trans women are that way. They absolutely are not.
Ditto.
Um, I will say that again. That's unfortunately, seeing that type of pornography without the role models, and in this day and age, can lead people to making some horrible decisions without that understanding of sexuality and gender expressions, and what people as far as sexuality goes, what they're actually attracted to, which is uh, a lot of times it's genitals. It really is. That's what it boils down to. And I don't think there's any shame in that. Again, that's integrating the animus, recognizing the biological fact, the program that you've got, and not shaming that and working with it.
That gets into too the old culture of quote pray the gay away.
Mm,
I don't think that you can pray the gay away or pray the straight away, no matter what your definition of prayer is. I really do think to a large degree that innate sexuality, as in what genitals someone's attracted to, or if they're attracted to genitals at all, I do think that that's just part of a person. What do you think?
Well, yes, with the caveat that, and so that we've discovered the gay gene, that's a thing, and we do know that that's something that's in a lot of people who are homosexual. That's set from birth, as far as I can tell. However, there are people whose sexuality can be influenced via trauma and some dissociation. So, especially especially females, because their sexuality tends to be a little more flexible and fluid, and that's again based on evolutionary biology. I won't go into that here. There's a reason for that. Um, However, it's possible that people can dissociate to a degree or reason with themselves to a degree based on trauma and then have consensual sexual activity with someone for whom their base genetic predisposition is not the same. So, for example, a female who has been abused chronically by multiple different males may, especially later in her life, decide I'm just going to be with a female. Now, of course, you get, you know, come out late in life lesbians. That does happen. We're still living somewhat in an age where repressed homosexuality can be a thing, and they'll come out later in life. But a chunk of them are, you know, batting for the other side, so to speak, because of that trauma. It's not that they are no longer sexually attracted to men or that they wouldn't, be able that isn't their default setting. It is. It's just because of the chronic abuse they have dissociated and then adopted a different sexuality. But that is different from what your birth given sexuality is, if that makes sense.
I agree.
Yeah. So just wanted to make that distinction.
Yeah, I meant though, like pray the gay away, as in trying to, um,
Change the genetic predisposition?
no, honey,
No. Okay.
pray. What does pray mean?
Yeah. To pray, like as in offer thoughts to the contrary?
No, pray the gay away, as in like shame someone morally into it,
Okay. Yeah.
but not it's not actually. I don't know. Okay, think on this a little bit more, maybe, because I don't know. I'm gonna ask you some off-camera questions later. And
Anyway,
think about it myself.
we do not support conversion therapy.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at.
Let's just put it that way. We do not think that that is a thing.
Right.
Anyway,
In any way, shape, or form.
right. So,
I think that's good enough.
yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, we as perhaps a last note here, if I think, we absolutely still need the heavily masculine male for in society to do the things that feminine or heavily feminine women don't or can't do, like heavy labor jobs, high risk jobs,
Hmm.
welding, deep sea fishing,
The trash man.
trash man,
Yeah.
stuff like that. We absolutely need those individuals just as much, I believe, as the masculine or males who perhaps are less masculine and are a little more femininity to them. They can occupy a very different social need within society, and that just goes back to um, the appreciation of all individuals on that gender spectrum, all combinations and the gender non-conforming individuals. So um, and we currently exist in a reality where again warfare and aggression and violence, those things are still present, and I don't see them going away anytime soon. So it's a very careful integration, culture by culture, individual by individual, on how to both um, incorporate aspects of the our primitive biological programming and this higher level of conscientiousness integrating into this abundant society that we now have, not necessarily focused solely on survival and reproduction, and the role models that we now need, I think, desperately need in order to help teach, people, young or old, as long as they're curious and open to do that. And that also, irrespective of gender, starts with the introspection of self, finding out who you really are, clear your trauma, clear your baggage, and then work on developing your strengths and compensating for your weaknesses in that way.
I agree. And what do you think in a society like that would be the common and maybe the healthiest, happiest rewards for all of that extreme masculine exertion and service?
Say that again? I'm having trouble incorporating the question.
In a stream.
Yeah, I mean, we're going on 2 hours and 40 minutes here. My brain's almost a little fried here.
I know, I'm still a little fried from that recent adventure I had. Um, okay, so let's say you're a hardworking trash man.
Yeah.
Okay. How would you want to be treated at home and in society? Like, what rewards would you be reaping that would encourage you to continue on with those heavy masculine services to, say, like your wife, your family, and then society? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, the trash man may be drawn to that job because he really likes the physical exertion of it, and to some degree, he's fulfilled by it. I'm not saying
Right.
every trash man is joyous about his job. I mean, I think actually trash men get paid pretty well, so that might be,
That's why I said it.
part of the
Hmm.
draw. So I mean, certainly, financial reward might be enough in that way, but something else that I think is of consideration is in supporting then that heavily masculine person with the uh, corresponding feminine support. So, for example, one thing that I thought was just absolutely sweet that I've seen some people do is they will leave, I don't know, like a tray of cookies, or they'll put a gift card or something out, as to give some kind of care or acknowledgement, or a letter even. I've seen some trash men read letters from children, that thank them for their service. But basically, during certain parts of the year, just to give recognition for them, support them, nurture them on that emotional level, basically to say, "Hey, I see you." That empathy that feminine is so known for, I think that across the board, whether you're a heavily masculine person or not, will speak volumes to supporting what it is that you then, what it is that you're offering, from your gender role, your expression. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah, I was looking for details, and you gave them with talking about the cookies, the
Yeah,
gift card, the letters,
yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah.
Do you think that there are things too that maybe partners or feminine wives, etc., maybe mothers too, could give or exhibit towards those more physically masculine people that would encourage them to be their best?
Well,
Does that
it
make
it
sense?
depends. Well, with children or not in the picture, that will make a big difference in, I believe, what that feminine
Hmm.
person can offer. So, if you are going to choose to have children, let's just say that as a masculine person, and let's just say, well, okay, masculine. No, just masculine. You don't have to be the biological father of those children. Let's
No.
just say you are the masculine person and you want to have children, and you want a partner to mostly stay at home with those children, a chunk of your reward then for going out and being the breadwinner, and this is why it's, oh my god, it's so crucial for you as that masculine person to really fully truly understand what it is that you want, because if you do not really want children, you would not be fulfilled by bringing children into the world and raising them, or at the very least being financially responsible for them. Do not have children. I know that's easier said than done, because a lot of you have already been led by, your sexual urges, and it's already happened. However, should you have the option, should you be a Gen Zer hearing this and you don't have children yet, I would highly recommend that you spend time contemplating that, for a good long while. And if it is children that you want, recognize that that is going to be a chunk of your fulfillment in life, or that it had better be if you want children. And so your partner, whoever you choose, is going to be somebody who wants to be a mother, who wants to be that stay at home person to raise those children. And your happiness, your fulfillment is going to be from your partner, is going to be in knowing and feeling that she's doing a good job raising your kids.
Yeah, I agree.
Period.
That is such a job.
Yeah. And so, but if there are not children in the picture and you don't want children in the picture, maybe you want to be the one doted on and catered to by your stay at home wife, then recognize that if she's going to take care of you in all those ways, she's going to be your mental, in some ways, mental stimulation, your physical, sexual stimulation, your emotional care. She's going to, do that, then you will have to provide for her like you would a child financially in some ways, because to run a business on her end is not something that she's going to be able to dedicate a lot of time to if she really is catering to you in that way. And I'm not saying that either of these relationships are the end all be all. Let me make that disclaimer that that is not the only way to go about the masculine and feminine gender roles. It's not. That's just one example. That's one avenue. That's one expression, one way to balance it. Um, there are plenty of other relationships then where like I was mentioning earlier, perhaps you're both working professionals and your fulfillment comes from your careers, and you both just really enjoy each other's company and really enjoy being able to bounce, I don't know, intellectual ideas off one another. And sex is something that you occasionally do. It's not a huge thing, not very romantic, whatever. Those relationships are perfectly valid, I'm sure, and can be very happy just the same. It's just you have to know that before going into it, and your particular gender expressions, your strengths and weaknesses, then for how you are going to happily interact with one another, not necessarily performative things like raising children or whatnot, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Sure. um so yeah, does that answer your question well enough?
Sure, honey.
If yeah,
Sure,
fried,
honey.
we're I think
It's okay.
I
It's
think
okay.
we're
You did a good job.
Okay, okay. Yeah, the patronizing, it happens.
It's okay. You got some of it right.
Yeah, some of
You
it
got some of it right.
right, what did I get?
Asking for specific things like what a mom or a feminine partner could do in order to encourage and reward you, and you completely went off on a different tangent, but that's okay. It was still great material, I think.
That was what I thought the
So
question
yeah,
was
like
gonna
bring
go.
so instead maybe okay, so I'm gonna go outside. I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna bust my buns at work for 12 hours as a trash man or electrician or whatever. And when I come home, it means a lot to me if my wife is standing there at the door with a martini. That kind of thing.
Feed me, Seymour.
Yes, that is correct. Like,
Yeah,
so
right.
what kind of high reward things could society, families, wives, and maybe even mothers give to super masculine, motivated people in order to have them keep going on that healthy, happy, motivated track? And so you were talking about letters and stuff, and then you started talking about dynamics and whatnot. All of that was great. I was just hoping for maybe some ideas if there are women out there listening or men who want to get more specific ideas about the type of personal rewards they'd like to receive. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That was
well,
really all.
it's tough for me to speak on that because I don't think I'm typical in that way, and I don't think I've ever been, because I'm not incredibly sexually motivated, and I never have been. My sex drive has definitely, while being on testosterone, it increased, but that doesn't mean that it's something that I looked at as a an exchange, something that can be exchanged like in a currency type.
Well, but why are you assuming I'm talking about sex, honey? I'm not.
I'm not. I'm just saying that's one thing that is
Oh,
very common
okay.
for males in general. That's, you will see that everywhere, whereas, oh, that's all the man wants is sex, which is not always
Mm-hmm.
true.
No,
Certainly not.
definitely not.
And that's one thing that I think this new age feminism gets wrong and calls toxic masculinity, that that's all men want is sex, demonizing these poor guys for a natural drive. And that indeed, maybe there are a chunk of them, a lot of them, that would definitely be happy if they went out and busted their buns and did this job, and they were when they had the energy, they would like some reward in that way. That's the currency that they appreciate. It's I'm not speaking from experience. That's why I say sometimes I think it's hard for me to speak on that because I'm atypical in that way. But because I'm more intellectually focused, logically focused. In fact, to some degree, I'm actually more feminine in that way because I appreciate conversation, talking things out, which is a very feminine feature, um, versus, being rewarded sexually.
That's true.
Um, so that I mean that's one thing. Um, Providing care like cooking meals.
Hmm.
Make a good meal. I know that that's an overly used trope about the 1950s housewife and having a good meal when you come home. And I promise you that the toxic masculinity trope of the guy coming home from work and get in the kitchen and make me a sandwich, like it's possible that he was a miserable ass and demanding that of her, without consideration for her having dealt with the children all day or anything else that she may be dealing with was pretty crappy, in my opinion. There is a grain of truth from what I can see, though, about having, feeling rewarded, appropriately compensated and rewarded by a feminine person being at home and having your meals prepared for you
Hmm.
after you've, had a long day out at work bringing home the bread.
Especially if it's a really delicious home cooked recipe that's one of your favorites.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, this is not exclusive to females or
Mm-hmm.
feminine. This can be a masculine, woman who's the breadwinner, and the father is, the feminine man, the stay at home. That can be a heterosexual relationship that happens to stay at home dads. It's uncommon. However, I believe that it can work just fine. Sex doesn't really have to play into that.
Mm-mm.
It's uncommon, sure, but that's again being appreciative of the gender non-conforming.
Right, right.
So,
Oh,
uh,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, no. Go ahead. I didn't have anything.
Oh, I was gonna say, having a really nicely kept and decorated house too.
Yeah, perhaps. That's something that I know a lot, a lot of men. There are memes and tropes out there of seeing the bachelor's pad versus what the feminine person's place looks like. She if she has the money, she'll go and spend it at TJ Maxx or Home Goods or whatever, IKEA, getting her place all comfortable and cozy and nice looking, and the male bachelor pads will often be a mattress on the floor, a TV in the corner, and maybe an Xbox or something hooked up to it. It's very bare bones, basic, minimum. And I'm not saying that all men are like that or all women are like that. As another disclaimer,
Mhm.
it's just the general trope, and so not all men will appreciate a uh, the masculine person being the breadwinner will appreciate having a home that's nicely decorated or anything like that. So that one's kind of dependent. He may just simply want it to be clean. It may not have to look exceptionally hotel spa experience, but as long as it's clean,
Right.
that can definitely be one of the things that he is rewarded with, not coming home to a messy environment when he's already been out dealing with messy situations.
Right. And these are all just general ideas that I'm popping out there for consideration, just so you know.
Yeah, and with these new generations, they could have a completely different understanding, different wants, really,
Hmm.
different expressions of their femininity and masculinity. What we're talking about are definitely what would be considered traditional. And so, I will be the first to admit that there are maybe, possibly, other expressions of that people can work out in their relationships moving forward, and finding the appropriately companionate relationship for them in that way then is will determine or will depend very much on what their versions of these gender expressions are.
Right, right.
It may not be traditional as we've described it all. It could be both of them working their own careers to some extent, no children. I don't know. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots of possibilities, and none of them are right or wrong. We're simply speaking about what the natural inclinations are based on the evolutionary biology, what the base drives and behave resulting behaviors are from primitive programming.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I'd be very curious to see what some of these other expressions are in generations moving forward. And really, the bottom line is just know thyself. That's it.
And they partner.
And a partner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
I travel, as you know, honey, I travel sometimes, and one of the places that I like to go, the culture is just it's really different there, and it's just so important to cater to your spouse, even to the point of having appearance being one of the rewards for doing a good job. And I think that over here it could be really useful, you know?
yeah. Well,
Cooking, cleaning, having things be beautiful or attractive to the other person, and then
yeah.
making sure that the other person is just utterly loved on and catered to. I just think it's really important, personally, especially for
Yeah.
masculine.
Yeah. And well, in appearance too, we can touch on that briefly here. That oftentimes the backlash that this new age feminism, the backlash has been, I'm not going to shave my pits and no makeup and
Yeah.
no bra and all of these things, women's liberation. And I to some degree I certainly understand all of that. Perhaps women, females have been tired of putting in that kind of effort if they feel like they're not being rewarded for it, or they feel like they're being objectified only and not
Mm-hmm.
appreciated for the individual that they are, and that their appearance, instead of being just a an addition, is instead the entirety of the interest um, of the other person. So I mean, I understand that. If we're keeping in mind though the signals of uh, evolutionary fitness, if you are overweight, or you have bad skin issues, or your hair's not healthy, those sorts of things, those are all indicators, and you have poor mental health too, those are all indicators that you are not a healthy individual. And even if somebody loves you, really truly loves you and cares about you, there's only so long that they are going to be able to keep the morale up, that things will improve and change before they begin to lose that and begin to question whether or not you are actually doing your part to improve, and for the betterment of you both, not just for yourself, but for your partner. And so I mean, makeup and things like that, I wouldn't consider makeup an absolute necessity.
I
um,
agree.
it's just when we say keeping up your appearance, it just means be healthy, just be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that is at least from what I understand, a lot of men speak about, they are not nearly as picky or discerning when it comes to who they would find attractive as women are. Women are really the females are really the gatekeepers on that one. And that's again another evolutionary reproductive um, strategy, uh, holdover. So
I agree.
anyway, so yeah, I think I really think that that covers a good portion of it. Um, there was one more. I keep saying that. One more, just one more.
Yeah, what you got, boss?
So there was. Hmm, where are you? Oh yeah. Hmm. So something to consider as an additional pondering. So in the stream that I did with Gar, that stream was called "Where Men and Trans Men Meet." This was the Irish gentleman who rehabilitates juvenile delinquents and ex-cons. Um, he was talking about how there's a portion of the male culture where basically ribbing at one another, making fun of one another, poking at one another, tearing each other down, that play, fighting, play, joking kind of thing is a way to blow off some steam, but also a way to kind of toughen one another up. And for certain males of a particular genetic mm,
Persuasion.
sure, genetic persuasion, genetic makeup, that may absolutely be necessary in order for them to integrate their animus, as Carl Jung would say, for them to properly control that primitive aspect of them, and that aspect which is to toughen them up to survive in a world that is presumably very aggressive, domineering in nature. And so I certainly see the necessity for that depending on the individual still, within culture. Um, but I would I would like to point out that there are a lot of, more sensitive leaning males or maybe more feminine males for whom that is detrimental to them. And that sort of culture is not actually helpful in, developing their best self. And continuing to propagate that across the board rather than just using that as a tool for certain individuals that would do best with it, rather than using that across the board, I think it needs to be selectively employed. And that's easier said than done. Um, because, I mean, if if we are to truly appreciate those, non-conforming individuals or the more feminine men, I mean, you could ask yourself, do you like being on the receiving end of that insult or the butt of a joke? Um, I mean, would you say that you actually liked it or enjoyed it? I mean, some of the men that do it, they do, they enjoy it. It's fun for them. And then there are others for whom it's hurtful, it's detrimental, and I think that's where, you know, um, that practice of ribbing, sizing each other up, that sort of thing, is called toxic masculinity. And that's one of those cases where I think it's toxic when it's employed on somebody who is not enjoying it, who is not helped by it. And so it can be toxic in that sense. However, to piss on men who are, amongst themselves doing that kind of thing, again, not allowing them to have that natural expression for themselves, that natural outlet, it's just one more thing that creates resentment, and builds pressure, and that pressure has to come out somewhere. And that's where I believe a lot of those juvenile delinquents, one of the reasons why they may be acting out in that way is again because they're being suppressed from their natural tendencies instead of being taught how to work with those natural tendencies. Um, and something else to note then, and this is a totally out there thought. Um, but there was an experiment done in Russia on domesticating a particular fox that was being used for the fur trade. What they wanted to see is if they could, instead of having to hunt this wild fox, they wanted to farm it and make it have a temperament in such a way that it would then be um, amenable to farming so that they could, produce their fur, their coats at a more cost efficient route. And what they found over several generations was that as they domesticated these foxes, as they made them more docile, the anatomy of the animals changed as well as the um, the quality of their coats, and to such the point that they were no longer able to be used for the original purpose that they were used for. And so this is perhaps a cautionary tale as much as just something to keep in mind, that if we are cultivating only passivity, only femininity, only docile nature in everyone, especially in the masculine, then we are opening ourselves up to consequence from other cultures who are not doing that, who are keeping themselves a warring, aggressive, nation culture. Um, on the flip side of that, it's interesting to see that, in cultivating that peacefulness, that domestication, that docile, gentle attitude, that it does actually create physiological changes within the DNA, within the genetics. Selecting for certain traits will absolutely change the outward expression. So that's something else to keep in mind when in doing any kind of social or genetic engineering in that way. Um, why and at what cost? So that might be an interesting place to leave the stream on,
Mm.
unless you have, but lest we demonize, traditional toxic masculinity or traditional masculinity across the board without applying nuance, let that be a consideration.
The only thing that I would have to add personally is that if I were to design a human culture, it would contain elements of each. So, classic, quote unquote, classic masculinity, and they would each be let to their own circles and devices to a large degree, taking care of infrastructure and the most physical jobs, and then the mid masculine people maybe would be professors at universities and mentors and counselors and therapists, etc. And I'm sure both groups of that would make wonderful fathers. And then the feminized or feminine males could fit in doing more artistic things along with the women. So, say hairstyling, event planning, that type of thing, or stay at home fathers, and then
The arts.
the arts, yes. And then we'd have the mirror side of that with women as well. And I could see a harmonious, flowing society in that way. But I genuinely do not think that human people are ready for the most part for that, because that takes a lot of nuance and a lot of acceptance of other opinions and challenging of egos and traditional roles and black and white thinking in a lot of ways. And from what therapists have told you and I separately, from my own studies, my own experiences, I really just don't think that human beings are at that point of being able to pick that nuance and essentially hand customize themselves, their marriages, their families, their communities, and then their societies and politics at large. And that's a whole other ball game that I'm hoping that projects like this and other ones that you and I are involved in will help to perhaps encourage more individuation so that we can move towards a customized society, as I prefer to term it. What do you think?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I don't have anything to add to that. It's such a tremendous undertaking,
Mm-hmm.
and it starts with the individual.
It does.
So, rather than trying to engineer other people, control other people, which
Mm-hmm.
is tyrannical and narcissistic, to assume that you know well enough to direct other people in such a totalitarian way. um, it comes by doing the best that you think you can for your within yourself, not for yourself but within yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and then being that example and offering the examples to those who display curiosity, rather than imposing yourself on others, which is why we have these streams here. We talk about them, we talk about our opinions. We don't pretend to know what's best for everyone out there,
Mhm.
and we appreciate feedback from people, um, what they think about that, or if they have questions, furthering based on our experience. We're happy to share at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Oh, and no hierarchy. I've noticed that most human beings sort themselves into a hierarchy of sorts. So, political quote unquote leaders and kings and queens and rulers and police officers and just authorities of all types. And at least for myself, I don't believe in respecting authority by default. I don't care who someone is. If I disagree with them, I have no problem in general speaking out against it, unless of course that someone is threatening my life. Then of course I'll be quiet, but I think that human beings, just people here in general, they respect authority, appeal to authority far too much for anyone's health or good. And it seems to me like the minute there's a quote unquote authority figure in the room, whether it's fake authority or a person with a title, then it seems as though a lot of logic goes out the window on each end. And I'm very sad at that. I hope that one day there can be a society where people are just people and they relate to each other individually, one on one, and there are no titles, there are no rulers because each person is his or her own ruler, if that makes
personally,
sense.
personally responsible.
Mm-hmm. As within, so without.
Yeah, and that requires a tremendous level of self knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that I think is, first of all, impossible to gain before a certain age. I mean, because our brains aren't even fully developed until 25 anyway, roughly 25. That's what they say. So
Mm-hmm.
to know yourself, you're still developing. So it's, in my opinion, it is impossible to fully and thoroughly know yourself until that point.
At minimum.
At minimum.
Mm-hmm.
So that's you've had this tremendous lag time, in that, and for starters, as a hurdle among so many others. But
Right. So what did we learn today, honey?
so what did we learn? Well, we learned that we have natural biological drives that are, programmed within our genetics, that it would be wise and healthy to be aware of them, to recognize them, be an acknowledgement of them, not to demonize them, and to work with them, that is in consideration of those around you for whom that particularly involves. Be respectful in that way, and conscientious of the consequences of that and the choices that you make as a result, moving forward. And that's being just a healthy individual. And as far as being masculine goes, um, it would mean, well, not just masculine. I mean, it applies to masculine and feminine as well. But if you have, masculine tendencies, realize that, force is not how you demonstrate healthy masculinity. Forcing yourself or imposing yourself on others is toxic masculinity. And being assured, within yourself and knowing yourself, and then politely excusing yourself from, the company of others who wish to, you know, try to control you or trigger you or use you in any of those ways, is the alpha way to display your masculinity. Um, and find that healthy way to gain that sense of, adventure, fulfillment, conquering, purpose, um, again, in consideration of other people. That's the healthy alpha masculine thing to do. Offer your gifts, not impose your wants.
I like that. Ooh, I have one.
Yeah.
Today I have learned that Carl Jung and Miss Frizzle know what's up. Pun
Yes,
intended.
yes. They oh, oh,
There.
I want to end it there. That's lovely. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening to the stream, and of course, as always, I welcome your comments and questions, your engagement from here. And until next time, cheers.